She killed a man to save her husband, and that's how the woman no one wanted became the legend of Frost Ridge. What happens when the bride rejected by an entire town pulls a trigger to defend the mountain man who saw her worth? This is the story of Mara Quinn, a woman too strong, too plain, too much. And Silas Boone, the trapper who chose her when no one else would. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The stagecoach rattled into Red Hollow just after dawn, its wheels grinding against frozen mud and loose gravel. Inside, 10 women sat crushed together, their faces pale with exhaustion, their hands clutching threadbare shawls and battered carpet bags. The journey from St. Louis had taken 3 weeks. 3 weeks of bone-jarring roads, tasteless food, and nights spent shivering in way stations that smelled of mildew and old tobacco. They'd come west on promises printed in newspaper advertisements, words carefully chosen to sound like opportunity rather than desperation. Honest women sought for matrimony in the territories. Respectable men of means await. Mara Quinn sat in the back corner, her shoulders pressed against the coach wall, her knees angled to avoid bumping the woman across from her. She'd learned years ago how to make herself smaller in spaces that weren't built for her frame. At 26, she stood 5'10" in her stockings, broad across the shoulders and hips, with hands that had worked looms and laundry tubs since she was 12. Her face wasn't ugly. She had clear gray eyes, a straight nose, a mouth that might have been called pleasant in better circumstances, but it wasn't delicate either. No one had ever called her dainty. No one had ever called her much of anything, actually, except when they needed heavy lifting done. The other women in the coach whispered among themselves, sharing nervous predictions about their waiting grooms. 2 of them were pretty in that fragile China doll way men seem to prefer, small-boned girls with rosebud mouths and tiny waists. 3 others were plain but young enough that youth itself served as currency. The rest fell somewhere in between, their faces worn by labor but not yet hardened by bitterness. Mara had paid her passage with money saved over 8 years of factory work, stitching 12 hours a day until her fingers bled and her back became a permanent curve of pain. The agency woman in St. Louis, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Crenshaw, had taken one look at Mara and frowned. "You're quite tall," Mrs. Crenshaw had said, her tone suggesting this was a moral failing rather than an accident of birth. "Yes, ma'am." "And sturdy." "I'm strong," Mara had replied, lifting her chin. "I can work." Mrs. Crenshaw's frown had deepened. "The men out west want wives, dear, not field hands." But she'd taken Mara's money anyway, $43 that represented every spare penny Mara had managed not to spend on rent or food. The contract was simple. Travel to Red Hollow, meet the men who'd paid the agency fee, and marry whichever one made an acceptable offer. If no offers came, the agency kept the money, and the woman was on her own. Mara had signed without hesitation. Anything was better than another winter in St. Louis, watching her youth drain away in that suffocating factory while the foreman made comments about how much space she took up. The coach lurched to a stop, and the driver's voice boomed from above. "Red Hollow! End of the line, ladies!" The door swung open and cold mountain air rushed in, sharp enough to sting. One by one, the women climbed down, their feet unsteady after so many hours of confinement. Mara went last, gripping the doorframe to lower herself carefully. Even so, when her boots hit the ground, she heard someone snicker. Red Hollow wasn't much to look at. A single wide street of packed dirt, wooden buildings hunched together like they were cold, a few scattered houses climbing the hillside beyond. But what caught Mara's attention wasn't the town, it was the men. They'd gathered in a loose half-circle near the general store, maybe 30 of them, dressed in work clothes and wide-brimmed hats. Some looked curious, some looked hungry, a few looked mean. They watched the women disembark with the focused intensity of buyers at a livestock auction, and Mara felt her stomach turn over. A man in a suit stepped forward. The local agent, she guessed, sent by Mrs. Crenshaw's company to facilitate the transactions. He was maybe 50, with a neat beard and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice too loud for the quiet morning. "As promised, we have 10 fine ladies seeking honest matrimony. Each has been vetted for moral character and good health. The terms remain as stated, a $50 match fee payable upon agreement, with marriage to take place within the week." Mara's jaw tightened. Match fee. like they were horses being sold. The pretty girls were approached first. Men stepped forward eagerly, removing their hats, stammering introductions. Within minutes, both of the China doll types had been spoken for, claimed by a banker and a dry goods merchant, men who looked prosperous enough to afford delicate wives who wouldn't have to haul water or chop wood. The younger plain girls went next, then the older ones. Mara watched as woman after woman was led aside for quiet conversations, for awkward handshakes, for the brief negotiations that would determine the rest of their lives. She stood perfectly still, her carpet bag at her feet, her spine straight, waiting. The crowd thinned. 8 women paired off, then 9. Mara stood alone. She felt the weight of their stares, the men who remained, the ones who'd been too slow or too poor or too particular. She watched their eyes move over her, watched them take in her height, her broad shoulders, the sturdy thickness of her waist. She saw the exact moment each one decided she wasn't worth $50. "Well," one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I asked for a wife, not a draft horse." Laughter rippled through the group. Not kind laughter, the cruel kind, the kind men use when they want to make sure everyone knows they're clever. Another voice chimed in, "Maybe they sent her to pull the plow." More laughter. Mara's face burned, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. The agent cleared his throat, his smile gone now. "Gentlemen, please. Miss Quinn is a respectable woman with excellent references. She's a hard worker and she's built like a goddamn lumberjack," someone interrupted. "Who the hell wants to wake up next to that?" The laughter was louder now, meaner. One of the other brides, a girl named Sarah, who'd been kind during the journey, looked back at Mara with pity in her eyes. Pity was worse than mockery. At least mockery was honest. Mara bent to pick up her bag. There was no point standing there while they entertained themselves at her expense. She'd find work somewhere. She'd done it before. "I'll take her." The voice cut through the noise like a knife through cloth, low, rough, and absolutely certain. Every head turned. A man sat on a horse at the far end of the street, maybe 50 yards away. He hadn't been there a moment ago, or if he had been, no one had noticed. The horse was a big gray gelding, and the man was bigger, tall enough that even mounted, he seemed to loom. He wore a heavy coat made of animal skins, and a hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. A rifle rested across his saddle, casual as a walking stick. The laughter died. The agent blinked. "I'm sorry, who?" "Silas Boone." The man nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves loud in the sudden silence. "I'll take the woman." Whispers started immediately, low and sharp. Mara caught fragments. "That's the trapper from Frost Ridge, and thought he was dead. And crazy bastard." The agent looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "Mr. Boone, I didn't realize you were, that is, we haven't seen you in town for quite some." "I'm here now." Silas reined his horse to a stop about 10 feet from where Mara stood. Up close, she could see more of him. A face weathered by sun and cold, a dark beard shot through with gray, eyes the color of winter sky. He looked maybe 40, maybe older. Hard to tell with men who lived rough. "The terms are $50, you said?" "Well, yes, but—" "Fine." Silas pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and tossed it to the agent, who caught it reflexively. "That's gold. Weigh it if you want. It'll cover the fee and then some." The agent opened the pouch, peered inside, and went pale. Whatever he saw there was enough to shut him up. Silas turned his attention to Mara. For a long moment, he just looked at her, not the way the other men had, not with judgment or dismissal. He looked at her the way someone might examine a tool they were considering purchasing. Practical, appraising, but not unkind. "You afraid of work?" he asked. Mara's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "No." "Afraid of cold?" "No." "Afraid of quiet?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." "Good." He shifted in his saddle. "I live 3 days north of here, up on Frost Ridge. It's isolated. No neighbors, no town nearby. Winter lasts 8 months and the wolves come down when they're hungry. I trap, I hunt, I trade furs twice a year. I need someone who won't break when things get hard. You look like you won't break." It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't an insult either. "I won't," Mara said. "You'll carry your weight, cook, mend, help with the pelts." I won't ask you to do what you can't, but I'll expect you to do what you can. I understand. Silas nodded once, as if something had been settled. Then get your things. We leave now. One of the men in the crowd, the same one who'd made the draft horse comment, laughed nervously. Jesus, Boone, you really lost your mind up there, didn't you? You could have your pick of... Silas turned his head, and the man stopped talking. There was something in that look, something flat and cold and utterly unamused, that made even the loudest bully reconsider his words. Mind your business, Silas said quietly. The man looked away. Mara picked up her bag. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't think anyone could see. She walked toward the horse, toward the stranger who'd just bought her like a sack of flour, and tried not to think about what came next. Silas leaned down, holding out his hand. Can you ride? Not well. You'll learn. His grip was strong, his palm rough with calluses. He pulled her up behind him with surprising ease, and Mara found herself perched awkwardly on the horse's hindquarters, her bag clutched against her chest. Hold on, Silas said. She wrapped one arm around his waist, feeling the solid bulk of him, the warmth of his body through the coat. The horse shifted beneath them, and then they were moving, walking first, then trotting as they left Red Hollow behind. Mara didn't look back. They rode in silence for the first hour, the town falling away behind them until there was nothing but forest and stone and the narrow trail winding upward into the mountains. The air grew colder as they climbed, sharp enough to make Mara's eyes water. She'd thought she knew what cold was. St. Louis winters could be bitter. But this was different. This was the kind of cold that lived in the bones of the earth itself. Silas didn't speak, and Mara didn't try to make conversation. She focused on staying balanced, on not sliding off the horse's rump, on not thinking too hard about what she'd just done. She'd married herself to a stranger, a man who lived alone in the wilderness, a man people whispered about like he was something dangerous. Around midday, Silas pulled the horse to a stop near a narrow creek. He dismounted, then helped Mara down. Her legs were stiff and her back ached, but she kept her complaints to herself. We'll rest here, Silas said. He pulled a bundle from his saddlebag and unwrapped it. Bread, hard cheese, dried meat. He handed half to Mara without comment, then crouched by the creek to refill a canteen. Mara ate slowly, watching him. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. No wasted motion, no hesitation. When he finished with the canteen, he stood and scanned the tree line, his hand resting lightly on the rifle. Are you looking for something? Mara asked. Always. He didn't elaborate. Do you do this often? Ride down to Red Hollow? No. Then why did you come this time? Silas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Needed a reason to come back down. Figured I'd kill 2 birds. It wasn't much of an answer, but Mara didn't push. She finished her food, wiped her hands on her skirt, and waited. We've got 2 more hours before dark, Silas said eventually. We'll camp tonight, reach my place tomorrow afternoon. Can you walk if you need to? Yes? Good. The trail gets rougher from here. He wasn't lying. By the time they stopped to make camp, Mara's thighs were screaming, and her lower back felt like someone had driven nails into it. Silas had chosen a small clearing sheltered by rocks on 3 sides, and he worked quickly to set up, hobbling the horse, gathering firewood, laying out bedrolls. Mara tried to help, but he waved her off. Sit. You're not used to riding. Not. She sat, grateful and embarrassed in equal measure. The fire crackled to life, and warmth began to push back the brutal cold. Silas heated water in a battered tin pot and made something that approximated coffee, though it tasted more like burnt bark. He handed her a cup without comment, then settled on the opposite side of the fire. For a long time they sat in silence. Above them, stars began to appear, more stars than Mara had ever seen in her life, scattered across the sky like someone had spilled a sack of diamonds. It's beautiful, she said quietly. Silas followed her gaze upward. It's clear. Tomorrow might snow. Mara smiled despite herself. Do you ever just appreciate things? I appreciate things that matter. And stars don't matter? He considered this. They matter when you're lost. Otherwise, they're just there. It was such a practical answer, so devoid of poetry, that Mara almost laughed. She didn't, though. She was starting to understand that Silas Boone wasn't a man who dealt in sentiment. "Why did you choose me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Silas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "You stood there while they laughed at you and didn't cry, didn't run. That's worth more than being pretty." Most men don't see it that way. Most men are idiots. This time Mara did laugh. A short, surprised sound. Silas didn't smile, but something in his face softened slightly. "I'm not a good man," he said after a moment. "I'm not mean, but I'm not easy. I don't talk much. I don't do well with people. If you're expecting me to court you or say sweet things, you'll be disappointed." "I don't need sweet things," Mara said. "I need to know you won't hurt me." Silas met her eyes across the fire. "I won't hurt you. I swear it." There was something in his voice, something raw and honest, that made Mara believe him. "All right," she said. They finished their coffee in silence. When Silas laid out the bedrolls, 2 of them, separated by the fire, Mara felt a knot of tension loosen in her chest. He wasn't going to force anything. Not tonight. Maybe not ever, unless she agreed. She lay down under the rough wool blanket and stared up at the stars that didn't matter, listening to the fire pop and the distant call of something wild in the darkness. Across the flames, Silas sat awake, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. Mara closed her eyes and slept better than she had in years. The second day was harder. The trail climbed steeply, winding through dense forest and across rocky outcrops that made Mara's heart pound with vertigo. Silas kept the horse to a walk, but even so, she had to concentrate on staying balanced. Her body ached in places she hadn't known existed. Around noon, they stopped to rest near a frozen waterfall, a cascade of ice clinging to the cliff face, beautiful and lethal in equal measure. Mara dismounted carefully, wincing as her legs protested. "You're doing better than I expected," Silas said, handing her more of the dried meat. "You expected me to complain?" "Most people would." "I'm not most people." He almost smiled. "No, you're not." They ate quickly, but before they could mount up again, the horse's ears flicked forward. Silas went still, his hand moving to the rifle. "What is it?" Mara whispered. "Quiet." She heard it then, a low sound somewhere between a growl and a cough. Her blood went cold. "Wolf?" she breathed. "Cougar." Silas moved slowly, positioning himself between Mara and the trees. He didn't raise the rifle yet, but his finger rested near the trigger. "Don't run," he said quietly. "Don't scream. Just stay behind me." Mara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She could see it now, a tawny shape moving through the shadows, sleek and powerful. The cougar's eyes caught the light, glowing amber. Silas didn't fire. He just stood there, tall and unmoving, the rifle ready but not aimed. He made a sound in his throat, low and guttural, more animal than human. A warning. The cougar watched them for a long moment, tail twitching. Then, as if deciding they weren't worth the effort, it turned and melted back into the forest. Silas didn't relax until it had been gone for a full minute. "Jesus," Mara whispered. Her hands were shaking again. "It wasn't hunting us, just curious." Silas slung the rifle back over his shoulder. "But we should keep moving." Mara nodded, not trusting her voice. As Silas helped her back onto the horse, she realized something. She'd been afraid, yes, but she hadn't doubted that Silas would protect her. He'd stood between her and the predator without hesitation, without theatrics. He'd just done it. They rode on. Bum. By late afternoon the next day, the forest began to thin, and the trail emerged onto a wide ridge. The view took Mara's breath away, mountains stretching in every direction, their peaks white with snow, the valleys below dark with pine. The sky was enormous, a bowl of pale blue arching overhead. "That's Frost Ridge," Silas said, pointing ahead. Mara followed his gesture and saw it, a cabin nestled against the mountainside, built from thick logs and stone. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant, "Someone's there?" she asked. "No, I banked the fire before I left. Keeps the place from freezing." As they drew closer, Mara could see more details. The cabin was bigger than she'd expected. 2 rooms, maybe 3, with a covered porch and a lean-to stable attached. There was a shed nearby, probably for storing furs and supplies. A narrow creek ran behind the property, frozen solid now, but likely running clear in summer. It wasn't a mansion, but it wasn't a hovel either. It was solid, well built, a place made to endure. Silas dismounted and helped Mara down, then led the horse to the stable. Mara stood in the yard, taking it all in. The silence was profound. No city noise, no factory bells, no shouting neighbors, just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. "Come inside," Silas called. "Get warm." She followed him up the porch steps, noticing how sturdy they were, how the railings had been carved smooth. The door opened with a creak and warmth rolled out. Not the blazing heat of a roaring fire, but the steady warmth of coals that had been burning for days. The interior stopped her cold. Books. Everywhere. Shelves lined one wall, crammed with volumes in various states of repair. A violin hung near the window, its wood gleaming in the dim light. A rocking chair sat by the hearth, a quilt draped over its back. The furniture was simple but well made. A table, chairs, a trunk, a narrow bed against the far wall. Everything was clean. Everything had a place. "You read," Mara said, her voice full of wonder. Silas shrugged, feeding more wood into the fire. "Gets long in winter." "And you play?" She gestured to the violin. "Used to. Not much anymore." Mara walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing over the spines of the books. Poetry, philosophy, adventure stories, technical manuals on trapping and forestry, a Bible, its pages worn soft with handling. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Everyone in town talked about you like you were some kind of savage." Silas didn't look at her. "People talk. But they're wrong, are they?" He straightened, brushing bark dust from his hands. "I live alone. I don't go to church. I don't socialize. By their standards, I'm probably damned." "You're not what I expected," Mara said quietly. "Neither are you." He moved to a cabinet and pulled out supplies: flour, salt, dried vegetables. "There's a pump outside, back by the creek. Water's cold but clean. You'll want to wash up before supper. I'll cook tonight, but starting tomorrow, that's your job. Fair?" "Fair." Mara found the pump where he'd said, worked the handle until icy water gushed out, and washed her face and hands until they stung. When she came back inside, Silas had bread baking in a Dutch oven set in the coals and something that smelled like stew bubbling in a pot. They ate together at the table, the silence between them less awkward than it had been. The food was simple but good, better than Mara had expected from a man living alone. After supper, Silas showed her the rest of the cabin. The second room was smaller, with a proper bed and a window facing east. "This will be yours," he said. "For now." "Where will you sleep?" "Out here, by the fire." Mara looked at the narrow bed in the main room, then at the larger one in the back room. "That doesn't seem right." "It's how it is." "But you—" "I'm not going to touch you unless you want me to," Silas said, his voice flat. "And I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, if ever. So you get the good bed, and I sleep where I've always slept. End of discussion." Mara didn't know what to say. Every story she'd ever heard, every warning she'd been given, had prepared her for a husband who would demand his rights immediately. But Silas wasn't demanding anything. He was giving her space, privacy, choice. "Thank you," she said finally. He nodded and turned away, busying himself with cleaning the dishes. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Mara stared up at the ceiling and tried to make sense of her new life. She was married to a stranger. She lived on a mountain. The nearest town was 3 days away. She should have been terrified. But she wasn't. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Mara Quinn felt something strange and fragile unfurling in her chest. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was too new for that. But it was close. It was hope. The days fell into a rhythm. Mara woke early, the cold biting even inside the cabin, and fed the fire until it roared. She learned to make bread the way Silas liked it, dense and filling, heavy with cornmeal. She mended his clothes, patched holes in his trapping gear, and organized the chaos of his supply shed. Silas taught her the mountain. He showed her how to read the weather and the color of the sky, how to recognize animal tracks in the snow, how to move quietly through the forest so as not to spook game. He taught her to shoot. Not well, not yet, but well enough to hit a tree trunk at 20 paces. "Why do I need to learn this?" she'd asked the first time he handed her the rifle. "Because if something happens to me, you need to survive until you can get to town." The practicality of it chilled her, but she learned. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Sometimes Silas read aloud, haltingly, as if he'd forgotten how to share stories. Sometimes Mara sewed while he carved, his knife turning scraps of wood into useful things: spoons, handles, buttons. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. One night, maybe 2 weeks after her arrival, Mara found the courage to ask what she'd been wondering. "Why do you live up here alone?" Silas's knife paused mid-stroke. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "I had a family once," he said finally. "Wife, daughter, lived down in the valley, near Red Hollow." Mara's breath caught. "What happened?" "Fever. 8 years ago. Took them both inside a week." His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "I buried them and left. Couldn't stand being down there, seeing the places we'd been together. So I came up here." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it hurt less." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Mara saw grief in his eyes, old grief, worn smooth by time, but never truly gone. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." They didn't speak of it again that night, but Mara understood now. The books, the violin, the careful way he maintained the cabin. These were the remnants of a man who'd once been part of the world, who'd been driven into isolation by unbearable loss. She understood, because she'd been isolated too. Not by grief, but by the simple fact of being too much. Too big, too plain, too strong. The world hadn't wanted her. And up here, in this place where no one cared what she looked like or how much space she took up, Mara was beginning to realize something dangerous. She fit, offset. Winter deepened. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind howled down from the peaks like something alive. Mara learned to split wood, to haul water, to keep the animals, 3 goats, a dozen chickens, from freezing. She learned that cold could be a living thing, something that tried to kill you if you gave it the chance. But she also learned beauty, the way morning light turned the snow to diamonds, the silence of a forest after a blizzard, when even the birds held their breath, the taste of venison stew after a long day's work, the warmth of the fire, the simple satisfaction of being tired in a way that came from accomplishment rather than defeat. Silas was teaching her to trap. He'd been reluctant at first, saying it wasn't woman's work, but Mara had insisted. If she was going to live here, she needed to know how to survive here. So he showed her how to set snares, how to bait deadfalls, how to skin and stretch pelts without damaging the fur. It was brutal work. Mara hated the moment of finding an animal caught and struggling, the necessity of ending its suffering quickly, but she didn't turn away. She couldn't afford to. One afternoon, checking their trap line, they found a lynx, huge and beautiful, its fur thick and silver gray. It was already dead, frozen in the night, its body stiff. "Good pelt," Silas said, kneeling beside it. "Worth maybe $15 down in Red Hollow." Mara watched as he worked the animal free, handling it with surprising gentleness. "Do you ever feel bad?" she asked. "Killing them?" "Every time." "Then why do it?" "Because I need to eat. Because I need money to buy what I can't make. Because this is how the world works." He stood, slinging the lynx over his shoulder. "But I don't waste them. I use every part I can. That matters." It was the most he'd said about his work, and Mara tucked the words away. Silas Boone wasn't a man who spoke carelessly. When he did speak, it was worth listening. They were halfway back to the cabin when Silas stopped, his head tilting. "Someone's coming." Mara heard it too, the distant sound of horses, more than one. Her heart kicked against her ribs. "Who?" "Don't know. Get inside, fast." They ran, the frozen ground crunching under their boots. Silas dumped the lynx on the porch and grabbed his rifle, checking the load. "Stay inside. Don't come out unless I call for you." "Silas, do it!" Mara obeyed, though every instinct screamed at her to stay by his side. She watched through the window as 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses blowing steam in the cold air. The man in front was well dressed for the frontier, a wool coat, good boots, a hat that hadn't seen hard use. He sat his horse like someone who'd learned to ride in a city park rather than a wilderness. The two men behind him looked different, rough, armed, their eyes scanning the property with the wariness of men used to trouble. "Silas Boone," the well-dressed man called, his voice carrying across the yard. "I hope we're not intruding." Silas didn't lower the rifle. "State your business." "My name is Victor Hale. I represent the Red Hollow Land Development Company." Hale's smile was broad and utterly false. "I've come to discuss a matter of mutual interest." "We don't have mutual interests." "I think we do." Hale dismounted, moving with the careful slowness of someone trying not to spook a dangerous animal. "You see, there's been some concern in town about the woman you took from the bride auction." Mara's stomach dropped. "What concern?" Silas's voice could have frozen water. "Well, there's some question about the legality of the transaction. You see, the agency maintains certain protections for the women in their care. Contracts, you understand. And there's been a complaint filed suggesting that Miss Quinn was removed from Red Hollow under duress. Bullshit. I'm merely relaying, okay? She came with me willingly. I paid the fee. We're married legal as anything. Now get off my land." Hale's smile didn't waver, but something sharp glinted in his eyes. "Mr. Boone, I'm trying to help you avoid trouble. If you just allow me to speak with Miss Quinn to verify her situation, no. Surely you understand the impropriety. I understand you're trespassing. I understand you've got about 10 seconds to get back on that horse before I put a bullet through your shoulder." The two men behind Hale shifted, their hands moving toward their weapons. Silas's rifle didn't waver. Now, Hale said, his voice smoothing over. "There's no need for threats. I'm simply doing my job. But since you're being unreasonable, I'll leave you with this thought. The law is on my side, Mr. Boone. And if this matter isn't resolved soon, I'll return with a marshal. Think about what that means for you, for your wife." He remounted, tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness, and rode away, his men flanking him. Silas stood in the yard until they were out of sight, the rifle still at the ready. Only then did Mara step outside. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice shaking. Silas didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the tree line, his jaw tight. "Silas?" "Trouble," he said finally. "That was trouble. Book." That night, Silas told her the truth. They sat at the table, a lantern casting shadows across his face. The fire crackled behind them, but the warmth felt distant. "There's silver under this mountain," Silas said. "A lot of it." Mara blinked. "What?" "I found it by accident, maybe 6 years ago. Was digging a new root cellar and hit a vein. I covered it back up, didn't tell anyone." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Mara had never seen from him before. "Silver draws people, draws greed. I didn't want that. I just wanted to be left alone. But someone knows. Hale knows. Or suspects. He's been sniffing around for a year now, making offers to buy the land. I've refused every time." Silas's eyes met hers. "If he can prove I'm unfit, if he can claim you were taken against your will, that I'm dangerous, he can petition to have this property seized. Then he'll tear this mountain apart, looking for ore." Mara felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "So this was never about me. It was about getting to you." "Probably. And you didn't think to tell me this before?" Silas flinched. "I thought I could handle it. I thought if I kept my head down, he'd give up." "But he didn't." "No." Mara stood pacing to the window. Outside, the night was impenetrable. She thought about Victor Hale, about his false smile and the armed men at his back. She thought about marshals and courts and laws written by people who'd never set foot in a place like this. "What do we do?" she asked. "I don't know." It was the first time she'd heard him admit uncertainty, and somehow that was more frightening than anything else. Mara turned back to face him. "Tell me the truth. Is there any part of their claim that's valid? Did you take me under duress?" "You know I didn't." "I know that. But can we prove it?" Silas shook his head. "It's your word against theirs. And you're my wife. Who's going to believe you?" Mara's hands curled into fists. Of course. Of course that's how it would work. A woman's word, worthless. A woman's choice, meaningless unless a man validated it. "Then we fight," she said. Silas looked at her. "This isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't." Mara's voice was steel. "I chose to come here. I chose to stay. This is my home now, and I'm not going to let some bastard with a smile and a legal document take it away from us. Mara, no. She moved back to the table, leaning forward until Silas had to meet her eyes. You stood up for me when no one else would. You gave me a place where I don't have to apologize for existing. So now I'm standing up for you, for us. We fight, together. For a long moment, Silas stared at her. Then slowly something shifted in his face. Surprise, maybe. Or respect. All right, he said quietly. Together. They spent the rest of the night making plans, checking their supplies, reinforcing the cabin's defenses. Neither of them slept, and in the darkness beyond the firelight, trouble gathered like a storm. Morning came too fast and brought no comfort. Mara woke to find Silas already up, standing at the window with his rifle, watching the tree line like he expected it to explode. The fire had burned low during the night, and the cabin held a bitter chill that crept through the floorboards. She sat up, her body stiff from sleeping in her clothes. Anything? No, but they'll come back. Mara pushed herself out of bed and moved to the stove, stirring the coals back to life. Her hands worked automatically, adding kindling, blowing gently until flames caught, while her mind churned through everything Silas had told her. Silver under the mountain, Victor Hale circling like a vulture, laws that could be twisted into weapons. How much time do you think we have? She asked. A week. Maybe 2 if we're lucky. Silas finally turned from the window, his face haggard. Hale needs to build a case. That takes time, even with money greasing wheels. And when he comes back with a marshal? Then we're in real trouble. Mara poured water into the coffee pot, her jaw tight. There has to be something we can do. Someone we can talk to. Like who? The law's in Red Hollow, and Hale owns half the town. The nearest territorial judge is 3 weeks' ride south, and even if we could reach him, it's my word against a land development company. Silas slumped into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. I should have told you about the silver before. Should have given you the choice to walk away. I wouldn't have walked away. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Mara turned to face him, her voice firm. I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't good enough, wasn't right, didn't fit. And then you looked at me like I was exactly what you needed, like I mattered. You think I'd throw that away over some metal in the ground? Silas met her eyes, and something raw flickered across his face. I'm not good with words, Mara. Never have been. But you need to understand, if this goes bad, if Hale gets a marshal up here with papers claiming your property, or I'm some kind of criminal, they could take you, force you back to Red Hollow, or worse. Then we make sure that doesn't happen. How? It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, and it hung in the air between them like smoke. Mara didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going back to being invisible, being mocked, being nothing. The coffee boiled over, hissing on the stovetop, and Mara grabbed it with a rag. She poured 2 cups, handed one to Silas, and sat across from him at the table. Tell me everything about Hale, she said. Everything you know. Silas wrapped his hands around the cup, gathering his thoughts. He showed up in Red Hollow about 2 years ago. Claimed to be representing investors back east, Boston, or Philadelphia, somewhere like that. Started buying up land, making deals with miners and trappers who were struggling. Paid fair prices at first, got people to trust him. And then? Then the prices dropped. Suddenly he's offering pennies on the dollar, and if you don't sell, strange things start happening. Equipment goes missing, trap lines get cut. One man's cabin burned down, ruled an accident, but everyone knew better. Mara's stomach turned. And nobody stops him? Who's going to stop him? He's got money, he's got lawyers, and he's got men with guns who aren't afraid to use them. The town sheriff's in his pocket. Half the merchants depend on his business. Silas took a bitter sip of coffee. That's how it works out here. Law follows money, and money does what it wants. What about the people he's pushed out? Couldn't they band together? Most of them left. The ones who stayed learned to keep their heads down. He paused. I'm the only one who's told him no and stayed put. And that's because I'm far enough up the mountain that it's not worth the effort to move me. Or it wasn't until he figured out what's under my land. Mara stared into her coffee, thinking. Victor Hale sounded like every factory boss and landlord she'd ever dealt with. Men who understood that power came from controlling things other people needed. The difference was that out here, there were fewer rules and more consequences for pushing back. What if we went to the territorial judge ourselves? She asked. Before Hale can poison the well? Silas shook his head. 3 weeks there, 3 weeks back. Even if we left today, Hale would have time to do whatever he wants. Seize the property, claim I abandoned it, file charges. By the time we got back, if we got back, it'd be over. So we're trapped. Yeah, the word hung heavy as stone. Mara set down her cup and looked around the cabin, at the books on the shelves, the violin gathering dust, the careful way everything had been built to last. This was Silas's refuge, the place he'd carved out after losing everything. And she'd be damned if some smooth-talking bastard with a land deed was going to take it. Then we don't run, she said. We dig in. We make this place so hard to take that it's not worth the cost. Silas looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. Mara, you're talking about going up against men with guns and legal authority. I'm talking about survival. You taught me that, remember? How to trap, how to shoot, how to read the weather. You taught me that the mountain doesn't care if you're scared. It only cares if you're smart and stubborn enough to live through it. She leaned forward. So we get smart. We get stubborn. And we make Hale wish he'd never heard the name Boone. For the first time since the men had ridden up yesterday, something like hope flickered in Silas's eyes. You're crazy. Maybe, but I'm your kind of crazy. He almost smiled. Yeah, I guess you are. They spent the morning taking inventory. Ammunition was good. Silas kept a healthy stock of powder, shot, and cartridges. Food was adequate for maybe 2 months if they rationed carefully. Water wasn't an issue as long as the creek stayed unfrozen. The cabin itself was solid, built with an eye toward defense, even if Silas hadn't been thinking about armed men when he'd constructed it. The windows were small and high, hard to shoot through. The door was thick oak reinforced with iron straps. The walls were double-layered logs with clay chinking that would stop most bullets. It's not a fort, Silas said, examining the structure with a critical eye, but it's not bad. Can we make it better? Maybe. We could reinforce the shutters, stack firewood against the outer walls for extra protection. I've got some steel plate in the shed, was going to use it for a new stove, but we could mount it over the door. He rubbed his jaw. Problem is, even if we turn this place into a fortress, we can't hold out forever. Eventually supplies run low or they just wait us out. Then we need leverage, something that makes them negotiate instead of attack. Like what? Mara thought about it. What did men like Victor Hale care about? Money, obviously. Reputation. Legal standing. What if we get proof of what he's really doing? Proof of what? You said strange things happen to people who don't sell. Equipment missing, trap lines cut, fires. Those are crimes, real crimes. If we could document it, maybe we could take it to someone who actually cares about the law. Silas looked skeptical. And how do we get that proof from up here? We don't. We go down there. Mara, not to Red Hollow, to the people Hale pushed out, the ones who left. They'd talk, wouldn't they? If they knew someone was finally willing to listen? Silas was quiet for a long moment, weighing it. It's risky. If Hale finds out what we're doing, he'll move faster, and we'd be leaving the cabin undefended. So one of us goes and one stays. I'll go. Absolutely not. Why? Because I'm a woman? Because you're my wife, and I'm not sending you down into a town where Hale's men might grab you the second you step off your horse. Mara felt a flash of anger, but she swallowed it. Silas wasn't being dismissive. He was being protective. There was a difference. Fine. Then we both go. We board up the cabin, hide anything valuable, and we go together. Fast trip, maybe 4 days total. And if Hale's men are watching the trails, then we don't take the trails. Silas blinked. You want to go cross-country in winter? You said yourself you know this mountain better than anyone, so we use that. We go where they won't expect, we move fast, and we get back before they even realize we're gone. It was a gamble, and they both knew it, but as Silas looked at her across the table, Mara saw his resistance crumbling. He was used to being alone, used to handling problems by himself. The idea of having a partner, really having one, someone who could think and plan and take risks alongside him, was still new. You're serious about this, he said finally. Dead serious. If we do this, there's no turning back. We're committing to a fight that could get us both killed. I know. Silas exhaled slowly, and Mara could almost see him making the decision, weighing their chances. All right, we go, but we do it smart. We prep the cabin like we're leaving for a month, we pack light, and we don't take stupid chances. Agreed? Agreed. They shook on it, their hands meeting across the table with the formality of a business contract. But there was something else in the gesture, too, a promise, an acknowledgement that whatever came next, they were facing it together. The rest of the day blurred into motion. Silas pulled out maps and showed Mara the route he was planning, a narrow pass that skirted the high country, threading between peaks where the snow was hardest and the risk of avalanche highest. It would cut 2 days off the normal journey to the settlement south of Red Hollow, but it required them to move fast and light. We'll need snowshoes, he said, spreading the map flat, and crampons for the ice sections. We can't take the horse, trail's too narrow. Everything we carry goes on our backs. Mara looked at the route, her heart hammering. She'd gotten stronger over the past weeks, but this was different. This was expedition-level travel, the kind that killed people who made mistakes. Can we do it? She asked. If the weather holds and we don't break anything, yeah. If it storms or one of us gets injured. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They packed methodically. 2 blankets each, food for 6 days, fire-starting materials, rope, knives, a hatchet, ammunition. Silas insisted on bringing the rifle and his revolver, and he gave Mara a knife that looked more like a small sword. Keep it on your belt at all times, he said. If we get separated, if something happens, you use it. Don't hesitate. I won't. He studied her face as if trying to memorize it. You've changed since you got here. You know that? So have you. Maybe. He looked away, embarrassed. I forgot what it was like, having someone to talk to, someone who gives a damn. Mara reached out and touched his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. I give more than a damn, Silas. He covered her hand with his, and for a heartbeat they stood there, connected in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or convenience. Then the moment passed and they returned to work, but something had shifted, something fragile and important. They spent the evening securing the cabin. Silas nailed shutters over the windows and barred the door from the inside, then showed Mara a hidden exit in the back room, a panel that could be removed to access a crawlspace under the floor. Last resort, he said. If someone breaks in and we're trapped, we go through here and run for the tree line. You really think it'll come to that? I think it's better to plan for the worst and be wrong than the other way around. That night they sat by the fire one last time, neither speaking much. The cabin felt different now, charged with the weight of what they were about to do. Mara found herself looking at everything with new eyes. The books she'd started to read, the table where they ate, the chair where Silas carved. This place had become home faster than she'd thought possible, and the idea of losing it made her chest ache. Hey, Silas said quietly. She looked over at him. Whatever happens down there, whatever we find or don't find, I want you to know something. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the words. You asked me once why I chose you. Truth is, I didn't know then, but I know now. Why? Because you see things the way they are. You don't lie to yourself or make excuses. You just deal with it. That's rarer than you think. He met her eyes. I'm glad you're here, Mara. Even with all this shit bearing down on us, I'm glad. Mara felt her throat tighten. Me too. They left before dawn, slipping out of the cabin like ghosts. The cold was brutal, the kind that turned breath to ice and made every step feel like walking through broken glass. Silas led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who'd traveled these trails 100 times. Mara followed, her snowshoes crunching in the pre-dawn darkness. The first day was grueling. They climbed steadily, following ridgelines where the wind had scoured the snow down to hardpack. Mara's legs burned and her lungs ached from the thin air, but she didn't complain. Silas checked on her every hour or so, his eyes scanning her face for signs of frostbite or exhaustion. You good? He'd ask. I'm good. And she was, mostly. Her body protested every step, but her mind was sharp, focused on the goal. They were doing something, fighting back. That mattered more than the pain. They stopped at midday in a shallow cave, just long enough to eat some dried meat and drink from canteens they'd kept tucked inside their coats to prevent freezing. Silas checked the sky, his expression troubled. Storm coming? Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Can we outrun it? No, but we can get to the pass before it hits. There's shelter on the far side, an old trapper's cabin. We hole up there, wait it out, then push through to the settlements. Mara nodded, chewing the tough jerky. How long will the storm last? Day or two, hard to say. That puts us behind schedule. Can't be helped. Storm catches us on the high trail, we're dead. It was said matter-of-factly, without drama, and somehow that made it more frightening. Silas wasn't exaggerating or trying to scare her. He was stating a simple truth. The mountain didn't care about their plans. They pushed on, and the afternoon stretched into a blur of white and gray. The temperature dropped further as they climbed, and Mara's face went numb despite the scarf wrapped around it. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on breathing, on not thinking about how far they still had to go. As twilight bled into the sky, they reached the pass. It was a narrow gap between two peaks, wind-scoured and treacherous. Snow had drifted into weird shapes, cornices hanging over edges like frozen waves, holes where the wind had carved through to bare rock. Stay close, Silas warned. Don't step anywhere I don't step. They moved through single file, Silas testing each footfall before committing his weight. Mara followed exactly in his tracks, her heart pounding every time she heard the snow shift beneath her. One wrong step and she'd plunge through into a crevasse, and out here that would be a death sentence. It took an hour to traverse the pass, an hour that felt like 10. By the time they stumbled down the far side into the relative shelter of the tree line, Mara's hands were shaking and her jaw ached from clenching. You did good, Silas said, and there was real pride in his voice. The trapper's cabin was right where he'd said it would be, a squat structure half buried in drifts, its roof sagging but intact. Silas forced the door open and they stumbled inside, out of the wind for the first time in 12 hours. The interior was small and musty, empty except for a crude fireplace and a sleeping platform built into one wall. But it was shelter, and that was enough. Silas got a fire going while Mara spread their blankets on the platform. They ate cold food, too tired to cook, and drank water that tasted faintly of metal from the canteens. Outside, the wind began to howl, and Mara knew the storm had arrived. We made it just in time, she said. Silas nodded, staring into the flames. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt in the firelight. Tomorrow we rest. Day after, if the weather clears, we push for the settlements. There's a place called Bitter Creek, maybe 8 hours from here. That's where some of the displaced folks ended up. Will they talk to us? If they remember me. If they're not too scared. He rubbed his eyes. A lot of people out here just want to be left alone. Can't blame them. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. It sounded alive, furious, like something trying to claw its way in. Mara pulled her blanket tighter and shifted closer to the fire. Silas? Yeah? After this is over, assuming we survive, what then? Even if we get proof against hail, even if we stop him, there's still silver under your land. Someone else will come eventually. He was quiet for a long time. I know. So what do we do? I don't know, Mara. I've been asking myself that same question for 6 years. He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up. Maybe we mine it ourselves. Small operation, nothing that draws attention. Enough to have security, but not so much we become a target. That's a hell of a balancing act. Yeah. Or, Mara said slowly, we walk away. Leave the silver buried and find somewhere else to live. Somewhere without a target painted on it. Silas looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. You do that? Walk away from potential wealth? I do it to stay alive. Money doesn't mean much if you're dead. No, he agreed. It doesn't. But there was something in his voice, something weighted with memories she didn't fully understand. Mara wanted to push, to ask what he was really thinking, but exhaustion was pulling her under like a tide. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts. Sleep, Silas said. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too. I'll rest later. Go on. Mara didn't have the energy to argue. She curled up on the platform, the blanket pulled over her head, and let herself sink into darkness. Her last conscious thought was that she trusted Silas to keep her safe, and that somewhere along the way that trust had become as essential as breathing. The storm raged for 2 days. They huddled in the cabin, rationing food and taking turns keeping the fire fed. Conversation was sparse. The howling wind made talking difficult, and both of them were conserving energy. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. They'd learned to exist together without needing constant words. On the third day, the wind died. Silas ventured outside and came back with snow crusted on his beard. It's clear. We need to move now before another system rolls in. They packed quickly and set out into a world transformed. The storm had reshaped the landscape, burying trails and creating new hazards. But it had also left the sky achingly blue and the air so clear that Mara could see for what felt like forever. The journey to Bitter Creek took longer than Silas had estimated. They had to navigate around massive drifts and backtrack twice when they hit sections too dangerous to cross. But by late afternoon, they spotted smoke rising in the distance, cookfires and hearths, the sign of human habitation. Bitter Creek was less a town and more a collection of desperate structures clinging to existence. Maybe a dozen buildings, all of them rough-built and weathered. A handful of people moved between them, bundled so thoroughly against the cold that they looked like walking bundles of rags. Silas approached cautiously, and Mara saw why. Several of the men stopped what they were doing to watch them, their hands moving toward weapons. "Easy," Silas called out. "We're not looking for trouble, just passing through." An older man stepped forward, his face mostly hidden by a scarf. "We don't get many visitors up here. State your business." "Name's Silas Boone. I'm a trapper out of Frost Ridge. This is my wife, Mara. We're looking for information about Red Hollow and the land company that's been operating there." The mention of the land company made several people tense. The old man's eyes narrowed. "That's so. And why would we tell you anything?" "Because I think we're fighting the same fight. Victor Hale's been trying to force me off my land. I'm here to find out how he's done it to others, and maybe, if we're lucky, figure out how to stop him." The old man studied them for a long moment. Then he spat into the snow. "You got stones, I'll give you that. Coming all the way up here to poke at that hornet's nest." He gestured toward a larger building. "Come inside, we'll talk, but I'm not promising anything." They followed him into what passed for a community hall, a single room with a stove in the center and benches along the walls. Other people drifted in, curious or cautious or both. Mara counted maybe 15 total, their faces hard with the kind of suspicion born from being burned too many times. The old man, he introduced himself as Garrett, poured them coffee that was more hot water than anything else, and they sat. "All right," Garrett said. "You want to know about Hale? I'll tell you, but first you tell me why I should believe you're not working for him." Silas met his eyes steadily. "Because if I was working for him, I wouldn't be here asking questions. I'd already know the answers." Garrett grunted. "Fair enough." He took a sip of the terrible coffee. "Hale showed up 3 years ago with money and promises. Said he was going to develop the region, bring in investors, turn Red Hollow into a real town. Some folks sold to him right off, got decent prices and figured it was their chance to move on." "And the rest?" Mara asked. "The rest of us weren't so eager. We'd worked hard for what we had, and we didn't want to hand it over to some city man with a smooth tongue, so we told him no." Garrett's face darkened. That's when things started going wrong. Over the next hour, Garrett and others shared their stories. Supplies that went missing or arrived damaged. Equipment that broke under mysterious circumstances. Animals killed or driven off. And always Hale's men nearby. Never caught in the act, but present, watching. One woman, her voice shaking with old anger, described how her husband's sawmill had burned down the day after he refused Hale's offer. The fire marshal ruled it accidental, but they both knew better. "We couldn't prove anything," she said. "That was the genius of it. Everything had just enough doubt that the law wouldn't touch it. And Hale kept coming back with new offers, lower and lower, until people got desperate enough to take them." "Those who didn't sell?" Silas asked. "Most left anyway. Couldn't make a living anymore, couldn't sleep at night wondering when the next disaster would hit. The ones who stayed?" Garrett shrugged. "We're too stubborn or too poor to go anywhere else. So we hide up here and hope he forgets we exist." Mara felt sick. This was systematic terror, calculated and cruel, and all of it wrapped in just enough legal respectability that Hale could operate openly. "Has anyone tried to report this?" she asked. "To territorial authorities?" "Report what?" Garrett's laugh was bitter. "That bad things happen to people Hale wants gone? You think a judge 3 weeks away cares about coincidences? We got no proof, no witnesses willing to testify, and Hale's got lawyers who'd tie us in knots before we could finish explaining." "So he just wins," Mara said flatly. "He's won so far." Silas leaned forward, his voice intense. "What if we could change that?" What if we could get enough people together, enough evidence that it couldn't be ignored? The room went quiet. Then Garrett shook his head. You're dreaming, Boone. People here are barely surviving. They're not going to risk what little they have left on some crusade that'll probably fail. Even if it means stopping Hale from doing this to someone else. Even then. Garrett's face was sad but certain. I'm sorry. I wish I had better news, but that's the truth of it. Mara felt defeat settle over her like a shroud. They'd come all this way, risked everything, and for what? A collection of people too beaten down to fight, too scared to hope. But then someone spoke up from the back. A young man, maybe 25, with scarred hands and angry eyes. I'll testify. Everyone turned to look at him. Jacob, no, Garrett said. You can't. The hell I can't. Jacob stepped forward. Hale's men burned my father's claim and killed our dog when it tried to defend the property. I saw them do it. I know their faces, and I'm sick of hiding. They'll come after you, someone warned. Let them. I'm tired of being scared. Others began to murmur, and Mara saw something she recognized. The moment when fear started to turn into anger, when self-preservation gave way to the desperate need for justice. A woman stood up. I'll testify too, about what happened to my brother. Another voice. And me. Within minutes, 5 people had volunteered. It wasn't many, but it was a start. Garrett looked torn between pride and fear. You understand what you're doing? Once you go down this road, there's no coming back. We understand, Jacob said. He looked at Silas. But we're going to need help. Someone to organize this, someone who knows how to navigate the legal system. Silas nodded slowly. I know someone, an attorney in Granite Falls, about a week south of here. He's honest, and he owes me a favor from years back. If we can get these testimonies documented and delivered to him, he might be able to build a case strong enough to bring in federal marshals. Might, Garrett repeated. That's a lot of risk for might. It's more than we had yesterday, Mara said quietly. They spent the rest of the evening working out details. Who would testify, what they'd say, how to get the information safely to the attorney without Hale intercepting it. It was slow work, complicated by fear and mistrust, but gradually a plan took shape. As night fell and the meeting broke up, Garrett pulled Silas aside. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. Watch your back, Boone. Hale's got a long reach, and if he finds out what you're doing... He didn't finish the sentence. I know, but I can't keep running. None of us can. Garrett nodded, understanding in his weathered face. Good luck then. You're going to need it. Silas and Mara found space to sleep in the community hall, wrapped in their blankets near the stove. Tomorrow they'd begin the journey back to Frost Ridge, carrying with them the fragile hope of 5 testimonies and a plan that had more holes than fabric. But as Mara drifted off to sleep, she felt something she hadn't expected. Determination. They'd found allies. They'd found a way forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep fighting. And that, she was learning, was all anyone could really ask for. They left Bitter Creek before sunrise, the testimonies written in careful script on pages torn from an old ledger book and tucked inside Silas's coat. 5 people willing to speak against Victor Hale. 5 voices that might not be enough, but were all they had. Mara's pack felt heavier on the return journey, though she knew it weighed the same. The difference was what they were carrying now, hope mixed with dread, a volatile combination that kept her nerves stretched tight. The weather held for the first day, cold but clear. They made good time retracing their route, and Silas seemed almost optimistic as they camped that night in the same cave they'd used before. We get these testimonies to Roland, that's the attorney, and he can file with the territorial court. Even if Hale tries to block it locally, there are people higher up the chain who don't like corruption. Federal marshals especially. He poked at their small fire, his face thoughtful in the flickering light. It'll take time, but we might actually pull this off. Might, Mara echoed, borrowing Garrett's skepticism. That word keeps coming up. It's the best I can offer. She pulled her blanket tighter against the cold seeping through the cave walls. What happens if Hale figures out what we're doing before we can get this to Roland? If he knows we went to Bitter Creek? Then we're in trouble. But he'd have to be watching every trail, every pass. Even Hale doesn't have that many men. Silas didn't sound entirely convinced by his own words. We'll be careful. Move fast. Once we're back at the cabin, we can fortify and wait for Roland to do his work. And if Roland can't help us? Silas met her eyes across the flames. Then we figure out plan B, which is? I don't know yet. At least he was honest about it. Mara appreciated that more than false reassurance. She finished the last of her dried meat and lay down, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Tomorrow they'd tackle the high pass again, and then it was just one more day to home. Home. Funny how quickly that word had attached itself to the cabin on Frost Ridge. She must have dozed because Silas's hand on her shoulder jerked her awake. His other hand covered her mouth gently, a clear signal for silence. Her heart kicked into high gear as she saw his expression. Alert, tense, dangerous. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. Someone's out there. Mara's blood turned to ice water. She nodded against his palm, and he removed it, handing her the big knife. He took the rifle, moving with agonizing slowness toward the cave entrance. The fire had burned down to coals, barely providing light, and the darkness outside was absolute. They waited. Mara's grip on the knife was so tight her fingers ached. She strained her ears but heard nothing except wind moving through the pines and the occasional creak of settling snow. Minutes crawled past like hours. Then she heard it, the crunch of a footstep on frozen snow, deliberately placed. Then another. Someone was approaching the cave, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. Silas raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel at the cave mouth. Mara positioned herself to his left, knife ready, her heart hammering so hard she thought whoever was out there might hear it. A shadow moved across the entrance. Then a voice, young and male and scared, called out, "Mr. Boone, it's Jacob, from Bitter Creek. Don't shoot." Silas didn't lower the rifle. "Dice, step where I can see you, slowly." Jacob emerged into the dim glow of the coals, his hands raised, his face pale with cold and fear. He was alone, Mara saw with relief. But that relief died when she saw his expression. "They're coming," Jacob said, his words tumbling out. "Hale's men. They rode into Bitter Creek maybe 6 hours after you left. Someone must have told them you were there, or they were watching the trails. I don't know. But they started asking questions, and when Garrett wouldn't answer, they burned his house." "Jesus," Silas breathed. He got out, but he's hurt, and they made it real clear what would happen if anyone testified against Hale. They're looking for you now. I took my horse and came as fast as I could, figured you'd camp somewhere along this route." Mara felt sick. "The others who were going to testify?" Jacob's face crumpled. "They're too scared now, seeing Garrett's place burn, seeing those men with guns. I'm sorry. I'm still willing, but the others, they can't. They have families." Silas lowered the rifle slowly, his jaw working. "You shouldn't have come after us. You're putting yourself in more danger." "I know, but you needed to know what you're walking into." Jacob stepped further into the cave, shivering violently. "They're headed toward Frost Ridge, maybe 8 or 9 men. They left yesterday morning, which means they're probably half a day ahead of me now." The math was brutal. If Hale's men had left Bitter Creek yesterday morning and traveled at a decent pace, they'd reach the cabin by late tomorrow. Silas and Mara were still a day and a half out, assuming good conditions. "We can't beat them there," Mara said, her voice hollow. "No." Silas was thinking she could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. "But we might be able to get close enough to see what they're doing, maybe catch them off guard if they think we're still days away." "That's suicide," Jacob said. 9 armed men against 2 of you? 3, Mara corrected. "If Jacob came all this way to warn us, he's in this fight too." Jacob looked at her, surprise and gratitude warring on his young face. "I don't know how much help I'll be. I can shoot, but I've never shot at a person." "Neither have I," Mara admitted, "but I'll learn fast if I have to." Silas rubbed his face with both hands, the weight of command settling on his shoulders. "All right, we rest for 2 hours. Then we move. We'll travel through the night if the moon's bright enough. If we push hard, we might reach the cabin by tomorrow evening. That gives us a chance to assess the situation before we do anything stupid." "And if they've already taken the cabin?" Mara asked. "Then we get creative. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. They woke Jacob properly, fed him what little food they could spare, and let him warm up by the rebuilt fire while they prepared to leave." The young man looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed with the kind of fear that came from watching your world burn. "Why did you really come?" Mara asked him quietly while Silas checked their gear. "You could have run, gone somewhere Hale would never find you." Jacob stared into the flames. My father built everything we had with his bare hands. Cleared the land, built the cabin, raised me and my sisters there. When Hale's men killed our dog and burned it all, I saw something die in my father's eyes. He just gave up, took Hale's money and moved to some town where he doesn't know anyone, where he's nobody. He looked at Mara. I don't want to end up like that. I'd rather die fighting than live knowing I ran. Mara understood that sentiment better than she could express. She'd spent years being invisible, being nothing, and the moment Silas had given her the chance to be someone who mattered, she'd grabbed it with both hands. Jacob was doing the same thing, choosing to matter, even if it cost him everything. We'll do our best to keep you alive, she said. Same to you, Mrs. Boone. They traveled through the night under a moon so bright the snow glowed blue. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The landscape transformed into something alien. Mara's exhaustion became a constant companion, her body moving on autopilot while her mind drifted. Several times she stumbled and Silas caught her, his grip steadying her without comment. Dawn found them at the base of the high pass. Silas called a halt, and they collapsed in the shelter of some rocks, too tired to even eat. Jacob fell asleep immediately, his breathing rough. Mara wanted to follow him into unconsciousness, but forced herself to stay awake while Silas did the same. You should rest, she told him. I'll keep watch. You're dead on your feet. So are you. He smiled faintly. Fair point. But he didn't close his eyes. Instead, he studied the trail ahead, his mind clearly working through scenarios. When we get close to the cabin, we'll need to scout it before we do anything. See how many men are actually there, what they're doing, whether they're just watching or actively searching. And then? Depends on what we find. He pulled out the packet of testimonies from his coat, the pages slightly crumpled but intact. These are still valuable. Even if we can't deliver them to Roland ourselves, Jacob could take them while we create a distraction. You mean while we get ourselves killed? I mean while we buy time. Silas's voice was steady, but his eyes showed the truth. He knew the odds weren't good. Mara, if it comes down to it, if there's a choice between getting you out safe or protecting that cabin, I'm choosing you. You understand that? She did, and it terrified her. The cabin is your home, your refuge. I won't let you sacrifice it for what? For you? He turned to face her fully. That cabin is just wood and stone. You're more than that. You're what made it feel like a home again. Mara's throat closed up. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that the cabin mattered more than she did. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was she felt the same way about him. Somewhere in the past weeks, Silas Boone had stopped being a stranger who'd bought her at an auction and become someone she couldn't imagine losing. We're both getting out, she said finally. That's the only acceptable outcome. Agreed. But if things go wrong, they won't. But if they do, he persisted, I need you to promise me you'll run. Take Jacob, take the testimonies, and get the hell out. Don't try to be a hero. Mara almost laughed. That's rich coming from you. I'm serious. So am I. We're in this together, remember? That was the deal. So stop trying to plan my escape and help me figure out how we're both going to survive whatever's waiting for us up there. Silas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Together. They managed an hour of restless sleep before pressing on. The pass was easier in daylight, but still treacherous, and with Jacob unused to the terrain, progress was slower than Silas wanted. The sun arced across the sky and began its descent, shadows lengthening across the snow. By late afternoon, they were close enough to Frost Ridge that Silas called for silence. They moved with exaggerated care now, using the tree cover, avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted. As they crested a small rise, the cabin came into view below them, and Mara's heart sank. Smoke rose from the chimney. Horses stood in a makeshift corral near the stable. She counted 7. Men moved around the property, their voices carrying faintly in the cold air. They'd made themselves at home. Silas's face could have been carved from stone. He studied the scene through a small telescope he pulled from his pack, counting men, noting positions. 8 that I can see. Probably 1 inside. They've posted guards at the trail approach, but nowhere else. Probably figure no one's stupid enough to come at them from the high country. Are we that stupid? Jacob whispered. Apparently. Silas collapsed the telescope. We'll wait for dark. There's a ravine that runs behind the cabin. We can use it to get close without being seen. Once we're in position, we'll have a better idea of our options." "What about the testimonies?" Mara asked. Silas handed the packet to Jacob. "You hold on to these. If shooting starts, you run. Don't look back, don't try to help. Just run and get these to Roland in Granite Falls. You know how to find it?" Jacob nodded, his face pale but determined. "I know." They settled in to wait, hidden among the rocks and pines. The cold was brutal without a fire, but none of them complained. Below, Hale's men moved with casual confidence, clearly not expecting trouble. Mara watched them and felt anger building in her chest. These men had come to her home, and yes, she realized, she thought of it as her home now, and simply taken it, as if they had every right, as if she and Silas were nothing. As darkness fell, lamps were lit inside the cabin. Through the windows, Mara could see shadows moving, heard occasional laughter. They were eating, probably helping themselves to the food stores she and Silas had worked to put away. The violation of it made her hands shake. "Easy," Silas murmured beside her. "Anger's good, but control is better." She nodded, forcing herself to breathe slowly. He was right. She needed to be smart, not just furious. When full dark had settled, they moved. Silas led the way down into the ravine, Jacob in the middle, Mara bringing up the rear. The descent was treacherous in the darkness, every step a gamble. Loose rocks skittered away beneath their boots, and Mara's heart stopped each time, certain the noise would bring men running. But the distance was too great and the men inside too comfortable in their assumed safety. The ravine brought them to within 50 yards of the cabin's back wall. They crouched in the frozen stream bed, so close Mara could hear conversations drifting through the walls. "Should have just burned it when we got here. Hale wants Boone alive if possible. Wants to make an example. Probably halfway to Canada by now." Silas's jaw tightened at that last comment. He gestured for them to move closer, using the shed as cover. They pressed themselves against its wall, and now Mara could see through the gap in the shed door. 2 men stood guard on the front porch, rifles in hand, stamping their feet against the cold. The rest were inside. "We need to know the layout," Silas whispered. "How many in which room, who's armed, where the exits are." "I'll go," Mara heard herself say. Both men looked at her like she'd suggested flying. "You're joking," Jacob breathed. "I can get closer than either of you. I know the cabin, know which boards creak, and if I'm spotted, I'm just a woman. They might hesitate long enough for me to get away." It was thin logic, but it was something. "Absolutely not," Silas said flatly. "You have a better idea?" He clearly didn't, but that didn't mean he liked it. "If you get caught, I won't." Mara tried to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Give me 10 minutes. If I'm not back, assume the worst and get Jacob out of here." Before Silas could argue further, she moved. She left the knife, too obvious, and kept low, using the shadows and her knowledge of the property to navigate around the side of the cabin opposite the front guards. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The window of what had been her room was dark, the shutters cracked open slightly. Mara crept up to it, pressing herself against the wall, and listened. Nothing. She risked a peek inside. Empty. The bed had been ransacked, her few possessions scattered on the floor. Rage flared hot in her chest, but she pushed it down. Not now. She moved to the next window, the main room. This one was lit, and through the gap in the shutters, she could see 4 men sitting around the table playing cards. 2 more stood by the fireplace, drinking from Silas's whiskey stores. She counted weapons. Every man was armed, rifles leaning against walls, pistols on hips. One of the card players spoke up, his voice carrying, "How long we supposed to wait here anyway?" "Long as Hale says," another replied. "He wants Boone bad. Something about silver on this property." "Silver? Way up here?" "That's what I heard. Worth killing over, apparently." So they knew. Of course they knew. Hale wouldn't send this many men without telling them what was at stake. Mara filed that information away and continued around the cabin. The back room, Silas's room, had 1 man inside, stretched out on the bed, fully clothed, apparently sleeping. The door was closed, separating him from the others. Mara retreated as carefully as she'd approached, counting steps in her head to avoid the spots where snow had drifted deep. She made it back to the shed without incident and found Silas exactly where she'd left him, his face tight with worry that melted into relief when he saw her. She told them what she'd seen. keeping her voice barely above a whisper. 7 in the main room, 1 sleeping in the back. They know about the silver. They're waiting for you to come back, probably figure they have all the time in the world. They're not entirely wrong, Silas muttered. He was thinking again, that calculating look in his eyes. 7's too many for a straight fight, but if we can isolate them, take them in smaller groups. How? Jacob asked. Fire. Silas looked at the cabin, and Mara saw pain flicker across his face. We set the shed on fire. It'll draw them out, split their attention. In the chaos, we take out as many as we can, grab supplies from the cabin, and run. You'd burn your own property? Mara was stunned. It's just a shed. I can rebuild a shed. His voice was rough. Can't rebuild us if we're dead. It was sound logic, brutal, but sound. Still, Mara knew what it cost him. Every structure here represented years of work, of carving out a life in this unforgiving place. Burning even part of it was like burning a piece of himself. There might be another way, she said slowly. An idea was forming, dangerous and half-formed. The man sleeping in the back room. He's alone, door closed. What if we could get to him quietly, take his gun, his clothes? One of you could walk out the back door dressed like him, and they'd think you were just one of theirs taking a piss or checking the perimeter. And then what? Silas asked. Then we pick them off one by one as they realize something's wrong. It buys a surprise, which is worth more than numbers. Jacob was shaking his head. That's insane. Too many things could go wrong. Everything about this is insane, Mara countered, but it uses what we have. Knowledge of the property, the element of surprise, and their assumption that they're safe. Silas considered it, his eyes distant. Finally, he nodded. It's risky as hell, but it might work better than fire. We'd keep the cabin intact, and we'd be controlling the engagement instead of reacting. He looked at Mara. You sure you're ready for this? Once we start, there's no stopping. I'm sure. He studied her face as if memorizing it. Then he reached out and squeezed her hand once, hard. All right, here's how we'll do it. The plan was simple in concept, hellish in execution. Silas would enter through the back door, still unlocked, Mara had confirmed, using the key he'd hidden under a stone. He'd take down the sleeping man silently, steal his coat and hat, and walk out as if he belonged. Mara and Jacob would position themselves at opposite corners of the cabin with clear lines of fire. When Silas gave the signal, 3 sharp whistles like a bird call, they'd start shooting at anyone who came out. The goal was to create enough confusion that Hale's men couldn't coordinate a defense. It was full of holes and assumptions, but it was what they had. They moved into position. Mara took the northwest corner, Jacob the southeast. Both of them had rifles now. Silas had brought a spare and Jacob had his own. Mara's hand shook as she checked the load, made sure the action was smooth. She'd practiced shooting at targets, at game. Never at people. The thought of actually pulling the trigger, of ending a life, made her stomach turn. But then she thought about Garrett's house burning, about the fear in Jacob's eyes, about every person Hale had crushed under his expensive boot, and her hand steadied. She watched Silas approach the back door, a shadow among shadows. He found the key, unlocked the door with agonizing slowness, and slipped inside. Mara counted heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. The door to the back room was visible through the window at this angle, and she saw it open. Saw a brief scuffle, movement too quick to follow. Then stillness. A minute later, Silas emerged wearing a coat that was too small for him and a hat pulled low. In the darkness, from a distance, he might pass for one of Hale's men. He walked toward the front of the cabin with exaggerated casualness, like a man who'd just taken care of business and was headed back inside. One of the front porch guards called out, "Took you long enough. It's cold as hell out here." Silas grunted something non-committal and kept walking. The guard laughed and turned back to scanning the tree line, not suspicious. Not yet. Silas reached the corner of the cabin just out of the guard's direct line of sight. Then he whistled, 3 sharp notes that could have been a night bird. Mara squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet night. Her shot went wild, missing the guard completely, but it did what it needed to, announced that all hell was breaking loose. Jacob fired a second later, and his aim was better. One of the porch guards went down with a cry. The other dove for cover, shouting for help. Inside the cabin, men scrambled, trying to figure out what was happening. Silas took advantage of the chaos to sprint for the shed, using it as cover. He signaled to Mara and she laid down covering fire, shooting at the cabin windows to keep heads down. Her second shot shattered glass and was rewarded with a yelp of pain or surprise. Men boiled out of this cabin, some through the front door, others smashing through windows. They returned fire wildly, not sure where the attack was coming from. A bullet whined past Mara's head and she ducked, her breath coming in sharp gasps. This was real. People were trying to kill her. She popped up and fired again, saw a man stumble. Didn't know if she'd hit him or if he'd just tripped. Didn't have time to think about it. Reload, aim, fire. The rifle became an extension of her will, and she fell into a rhythm born of desperation. Across the yard, Jacob was doing the same. His shots were more measured, more accurate. 2 more of Hale's men went down, and the others realized they were caught in a crossfire. They tried to regroup, to find cover, but Silas had positioned them perfectly. The cabin that should have been their fortress had become a trap. "Fall back," someone shouted. "Get to the horses!" 3 men broke for the corral, laying down suppressing fire. Silas stepped out from behind the shed and shot one cleanly through the chest. The man dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The other 2 made it to the horses and mounted up, spurring away into the darkness. That left 3 still fighting. They'd taken cover behind a water trough and were shooting methodically now, no longer panicking. One of them was directing the others, his voice calm and authoritative, probably whoever Hale had put in charge. "We need to move," Silas shouted. "They're going to pin us down." He was right. The remaining men had recovered from the initial shock and were starting to coordinate. Mara saw one of them working his way around the side, trying to flank Jacob's position. She aimed carefully and fired, catching him in the leg. He went down screaming, but her muzzle flash had given away her exact location. Bullets chewed into the corner of the building near her head, showering her with splinters. Mara threw herself flat, crawling backward, trying to find new cover. Her heart was a drum, her breath ragged. Silas was moving now, circling wide to get behind the water trough. Mara saw what he was doing and tried to draw fire to give him time. She popped up, fired twice, ducked back down as return fire came immediately. 1 shot. 2. Drawing their attention. Then Silas was there, behind them, and his rifle spoke twice in quick succession. Both men dropped. The sudden silence was deafening. Mara stayed down, waiting, her entire body shaking. Seconds passed like hours. Finally, Silas called out, "Clear, stay alert, but I think that's all of them." She stood on wobbly legs and stepped into the open. Bodies littered the yard, dark shapes in the snow. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, acrid and choking. Jacob emerged from his position, his face white as bone, and walked toward them like he was moving through a dream. "We did it," he said, his voice hollow. "We actually did it." Silas was checking the bodies, making sure no one was faking. His face was grim, and Mara could see the toll this was taking on him. However necessary it had been, killing men, even men who'd come to kill him, wasn't something Silas did lightly. "2 got away," he said. "They'll ride straight to Hale, and he'll know what happened. We've got maybe 2 days before he comes back with more men, better prepared." "Then we use those 2 days," Mara said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and cold. "We get ready, and we end this." Silas looked at her, something like respect and sorrow mixed in his expression. "Yeah, we end this." They spent the rest of the night cleaning up the carnage and fortifying the cabin. It was grim work, and none of them spoke much. As dawn broke over Frost Ridge, painting the snow pink and gold, Mara stood on the porch and looked out at the mountains. Somewhere down there, Victor Hale was getting news that his men had failed, that Silas Boone and his wife had fought back and won, and Mara knew with sick certainty that what came next would be worse. But she also knew they'd face it, together, whatever it cost. The bodies were the first problem. They couldn't leave them where they'd fallen, not just because of decency, though that mattered, but because the sight would demoralize them every time they looked out a window. Silas and Jacob dragged the corpses to a gully about 100 yards from the cabin while Mara worked inside, scrubbing blood from the porch boards with snow and trying not to think too hard about what she was cleaning. Her hands were raw and red by the time she finished, and the smell of iron still clung to her nostrils. She'd killed a man last night, maybe more than one. In the chaos, she couldn't be sure which of her shots had found their targets. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and immovable. She kept waiting to feel something, horror, guilt, remorse. But all she felt was a strange numbness punctuated by flashes of the same rage that had carried her through the fight. These men had come to take her home. They'd worked for a man who crushed people for profit, and they'd have killed her and Silas without a second thought. She straightened up, her back protesting, and looked at the cabin, really looked at it. Bullet holes pocked the logs. One window was completely shattered, covered now with a blanket nailed across the frame. The front door hung crooked on its hinges from where someone had tried to kick it in during the fight. It was damaged, but standing. Like her. Like Silas. The men returned as the sun climbed higher, both of them grim-faced and exhausted. Jacob looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his eyes haunted. Silas just looked tired, a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "It's done," he said simply, then moved to the pump to wash his hands. The water that ran off them was pink. They ate a cold meal, none of them had the energy to cook, and then Silas spread out a map on the table. It was hand-drawn, marking the property boundaries, the approaches, the sight lines. "We have maybe 48 hours before Hale comes back," he said, tapping the map with one finger. "This time he'll bring more men, maybe 15, maybe 20, and they won't make the same mistakes. They'll be ready for resistance." "Can we hold against those numbers?" Mara asked. "No." Silas's answer was blunt. "Not in a straight fight, but we don't have to win. We just have to make it so costly that Hale decides it's not worth it." Jacob leaned over the map, studying it. "What if we don't wait for them to come to us? What if we hit them first?" Silas looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, those two men who got away, they're going to ride straight to Red Hollow to report. What if we intercept them before they get there? Or better yet, what if we go to Red Hollow ourselves and confront Hale directly?" "That's suicide," Mara said immediately. "He owns that town. We'd be walking into a nest of vipers." "Maybe," Jacob conceded. "But right now he thinks he has time. He thinks he can regroup and come at you with overwhelming force. If we show up in Red Hollow, if we make a public accusation with the testimonies as evidence, we force his hand, make him defend himself in front of witnesses instead of hiding behind hired guns." Silas was quiet, considering. "It's risky, but it might be our only play. If we stay here and wait, we're just delaying the inevitable. Eventually he'll bring enough men that we can't hold out. And if we go to Red Hollow, and it goes wrong, we're dead," Mara pointed out. "At least here we have defensible ground." "Here we're trapped," Silas countered. "There's a difference between defensible and sustainable. Jacob's right. We need to change the game, not just play defense." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to find a safer option, but she couldn't. The logic was sound even if the risk was terrifying. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running out of time. Their only advantage was initiative, the ability to act rather than react. "All right," she said finally. "So we go to Red Hollow. Then what? We walk into the saloon and challenge Hale to a duel? We find witnesses," Silas said. "People he hasn't bought off yet. We make enough noise that he can't just make us disappear without consequences. And we get word to Roland somehow, send the testimonies ahead if we can." "That's a lot of ifs and maybes," Jacob said. "You have a better idea?" He didn't. None of them did. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Silas showed Mara how to rig the cabin with surprises, tripwires connected to noisemakers, a back exit that could be barricaded from the outside to slow pursuit, caches of supplies hidden in the woods in case they had to run. It was desperate work, the preparations of people who knew they might not survive but were determined to make their deaths expensive. As evening fell, they sat around the table one last time. Tomorrow they'd ride for Red Hollow, leaving the cabin to whatever fate awaited it. The thought made Mara's chest ache. This place had become more than shelter. It was the first home she'd ever had where she didn't have to apologize for existing. "I need to tell you something," Silas said suddenly. He was staring at his hands, not meeting their eyes. "About the silver." Mara and Jacob waited. "I found it 6 years ago, like I said, but I've been mining it. Small amounts, just enough to trade for supplies without drawing attention. There's about $2,000 worth of refined silver hidden under the root cellar." He finally looked up. "If something happens to me, that's yours. Both of you. It's enough to start over somewhere else." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Mara said firmly. "But if it does, it won't." Silas smiled faintly. "You're stubborn as hell, you know that?" "I learned from the best." Jacob cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, Mr. Boone, Mrs. Boone, I'm glad I met you. Both of you. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least I got to see what it looks like when people refuse to be beaten down. We haven't won yet, Silas cautioned. No, but you're still fighting. That counts for something. They tried to sleep, but none of them managed more than an hour or two. Mara lay in her bed, the same bed where she'd slept that first night, when everything had been so uncertain and new, and listened to the cabin settle around her. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. The mountain, indifferent to human struggle, continued its ancient patience. She thought about this woman she'd been 2 months ago. Desperate, invisible, willing to gamble everything on the word of a stranger. That woman felt like someone from a different life. The Mara who lay here now had blood on her hands and steel in her spine. She'd shot at men. She'd held ground in a firefight. She'd chosen to stand rather than run. And tomorrow she might die for that choice. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it brought a strange clarity. If she died tomorrow, at least she'd die as someone who mattered, someone who'd fought for something worth fighting for. That was more than she'd ever expected from life. She must have slept eventually because Silas was shaking her awake, pale dawn light filtering through the blanket-covered window. Time to go. They saddled the horses, Silas's big gray and 2 others they'd taken from Hale's men, and loaded them with minimal supplies. Speed mattered more than comfort now. Jacob checked his rifle 3 times, his nervousness showing. Mara felt calmer than she had any right to be, as if some part of her had already accepted whatever was coming. The ride down to Red Hollow took most of the day. They avoided the main trail, using paths that only Silas knew, moving through country so rough the horses struggled. But it kept them hidden, and by late afternoon they were in the hills overlooking the town. Red Hollow looked exactly as Mara remembered it, mean and small and full of itself. Smoke rose from chimneys. People moved along the street, going about their business. It all looked so normal that for a moment she questioned whether this was really necessary. Maybe they could just ride on, head south to Granite Falls, let the law handle it. Then she saw the building at the end of the main street, a 2-story structure with fresh paint and glass windows that actually looked clean. A sign over the door read Red Hollow Land Development Company, and standing on the porch, talking with 2 men in expensive coats, was Victor Hale. There he is, Silas said quietly, bold as brass and twice as shiny. What's the plan? Jacob asked. Silas studied the town, his eyes moving from building to building. We need an audience, somewhere public where Hale can't just have us shot without witnesses. The saloon's too easy to control. He probably owns it. The general store, maybe, or the church. There, Mara said, pointing. A small crowd had gathered near what looked like a community notice board. People reading announcements, chatting, visible from half the street. If we make our accusation there, in front of everyone, Hale has to respond publicly. Or he just has his men drag us away and nobody says a word because they're too scared, Jacob pointed out. Maybe, Mara admitted. But maybe not. You saw what happened in Bitter Creek. People are angry. They're just waiting for someone to give them permission to show it. Silas nodded slowly. All right, we ride in together, casual-like. We go to that notice board and I read out the testimonies loud enough for everyone to hear. We call Hale out by name and dare him to deny it. Either he comes to shut us up personally, in which case we get our confrontation, or he sends his men, in which case we've proven he's got something to hide. And if he just starts shooting, Jacob asked, then we shoot back and hope we take him with us. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was what they had. They rode down into Red Hollow as the sun touched the western peaks, casting long shadows across the street. People stopped to stare. 3 riders coming in hard, dust on their clothes and determination in their eyes. Mara saw recognition flicker across a few faces. Some people remembered her, the woman no one had wanted. They tied their horses near the notice board and dismounted. Silas pulled the testimonies from his coat, the pages worn now but still legible. A small crowd had gathered, curious about these strangers. Listen up, Silas called out, his voice carrying. My name is Silas Boone. I own property on Frost Ridge. And I'm here to tell you about a man named Victor Hale who's been terrorizing honest people for 2 years. The crowd went silent. Heads turned. Down the street, near his office, Hale straightened up, his attention drawn by the commotion. Silas read the first testimony, Jacob's account of his father's property being burned, then the second, and the third. His voice never wavered, each word clear and sharp. By the time he finished, maybe 40 people had gathered. Some looked sympathetic. Some looked frightened. A few looked angry. These people were driven from their homes by intimidation, violence, and arson, Silas continued, all because they wouldn't sell their property to Victor Hale. He uses the law when it suits him and breaks it when it doesn't, and he does it all with a smile and a handshake. Murmuring rippled through the crowd. Mara could see the calculation happening, people weighing their fear against their resentment, their self-interest against their conscience. Then Hale was there, pushing through the crowd with two of his men flanking him. His face was composed, but Mara could see the fury in his eyes. "Mr. Boone," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "What a surprise to see you. I heard you'd had some trouble up on your mountain. Lost several of my employees, I understand." "Your employees attacked my home," Silas said flatly. "We defended ourselves. That's not how my men tell it. They say you ambushed them without provocation, murdered them in cold blood." Hale turned to address the crowd. "This man is a killer and a liar. He's making wild accusations to cover his own crimes." "Then why did your men have my property surrounded?" Silas demanded. "Why were they inside my cabin, eating my food, waiting for me like I was the criminal?" "They were there on legal business. I have papers." "You have papers claiming my wife was taken against her will. That's a lie and you know it. Mara came with me willingly. We're legally married. But you needed an excuse to seize my land, so you invented one." Hale's smile tightened. "Mrs. Boone, perhaps you'd like to speak for yourself. Tell these good people whether you came willingly or whether you were coerced." All eyes turned to Mara. She felt her heart hammering but kept her voice steady. "I chose to go with Silas. Nobody forced me. I had every chance to change my mind, and I didn't. We're married legal and proper, and this man's claims are nothing but a land grab dressed up in legal language." "The word of a woman defending her husband," Hale said dismissively. "Hardly credible." "The word of 5 people telling the same story," Mara shot back. "Or are you saying they're all lying too?" "I'm saying people will claim anything if someone pays them enough." "How much did Boone offer you to make these accusations?" "We're not being paid." Jacob stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. "I watched your men burn my father's life's work. I know what you are, Hale. You're a thief hiding behind expensive suits and corrupt officials." The crowd was murmuring louder now, people taking sides. Mara could see the balance shifting, could feel the mood turning. They'd struck a nerve. These people knew, deep down, that what Silas was saying was true. They'd seen it happen to their neighbors, had maybe benefited from it themselves, or feared they'd be next. Hale saw it too. His face hardened. "Sheriff," he called out, "arrest these people for disturbing the peace and making false accusations." A man with a tin star pushed through the crowd. He looked uncomfortable but determined. "You folks need to come with me." "On what grounds?" Silas demanded. "Public disturbance. Making unsubstantiated claims against a respected businessman. Take your pick." The sheriff's hand rested on his gun. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "He's in Hale's pocket," someone in the crowd muttered. "Everyone knows it." "That's enough!" The sheriff's voice cracked like a whip. "Disperse, all of you. Show's over." But people weren't moving. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen. This was the moment, Mara realized, the tipping point. If they backed down now, Hale won. If they resisted, things would get bloody fast. Silas must have been thinking the same thing because he didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he held up the testimonies. "These statements were witnessed and signed. They're going to the territorial court whether you arrest me or not. I've already sent copies south with a courier. So you can lock me up, you can shoot me, but it won't stop what's coming." It was a bluff. They hadn't sent anything ahead, but it was a good one. Mara saw doubt flicker across Hale's face. If he acted too aggressively now, it would look like an admission of guilt. But if he let them walk, he lost control of the narrative. "Let them go," someone called from the crowd. "Let the court decide if there's truth to it." "Yeah, if Hale's innocent, he's got nothing to worry about," another voice added. The crowd was turning. Not entirely, not unanimously, but enough. Enough that Hale couldn't just have them killed without consequences. He'd built his power on the appearance of legitimacy, and that appearance was cracking. "Fine," Hale said, his voice dripping with false reasonableness. "Let them go. Let them make their case to the territorial judge if they think they have one. I welcome the scrutiny. I have nothing to hide." But his eyes told a different story. His eyes promised that this wasn't over. The sheriff looked between Hale and Silas, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. You heard him. You're free to go, but I'd advise you to leave town. Now. They didn't need to be told twice. Silas folded the testimonies back into his coat, and they moved toward their horses, the crowd parting to let them through. Mara's skin crawled with the certainty that any second a bullet would slam into her back. But they made it to the horses and mounted up without incident. As they rode out, Mara looked back one last time. Hale stood on the street watching them go, his face a mask of controlled fury. She knew with absolute certainty that he would come for them. Soon. With everything he had. Well, Jacob said once they were clear of town, that went better than I expected. It went exactly as expected, Silas corrected. We made our play, he made his, and now we're both committed. The real fight's coming. How long do we have? Tonight? Maybe tomorrow. He can't wait longer than that. Every hour we're alive is another hour for doubts to spread in Red Hollow. He'll come fast and he'll come hard. They didn't go back to Frost Ridge. Instead, Silas led them to a narrow canyon maybe 3 miles from the cabin, a place with high walls and limited approaches, defensible if it came to that. We camp here tonight, he said. Keep watch in shifts. At first light, we go back to the cabin and finish our preparations. Preparations for what? Mara asked. We can't hold off 20 men even with good terrain. No, Silas agreed, but we can make it hell for them to try. And we can make sure that if we go down, the story gets out. That's what matters now, making sure Hale can't just bury this. They made a cold camp, no fire that might give away their position, and took turns on watch. When Mara's shift came, she sat on a flat rock overlooking their small camp and watched the stars wheel overhead. The night was cold enough to hurt, her breath coming out in white plumes. She thought about the woman in Red Hollow who'd looked at her with pity all those weeks ago. Wondered what that woman would think seeing her now, scarred, hard, dangerous. Would she recognize the desperate bride who'd stood there being mocked? Probably not. That woman was gone, dead, replaced by someone who'd learned to fight, to shoot, to stand her ground against men with guns and no conscience. Movement below caught her eye. Silas, climbing up to join her even though it wasn't his watch yet. Can't sleep, she asked. Not really. He settled beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Keep thinking about tomorrow, about all the ways it could go wrong. That's cheerful. I'm a realist. He was quiet for a moment. Mara, if things go bad, don't. I need to say this. If things go bad and you have a chance to run, you take it. Don't wait for me. Don't try to be a hero. Just run. We've had this conversation, and I'm having it again because I mean it. He turned to face her. You've got too much life left in you to throw it away on a mountain for a fight that might not even matter. It matters, Mara said fiercely. It matters, because if we don't fight, if we don't stand up, then men like Hale win. They always win. And I'm done letting men like that decide who matters and who doesn't. Silas studied her face in the starlight. When did you get so brave? I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. That's the same thing, I think. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid and real. They sat like that for a long time, watching the night sky, neither of them speaking. There was too much to say and not enough words for any of it. Finally, Silas stood, preparing to head back down to his bedroll, but Mara caught his hand, stopping him. Silas? Yeah? I'm glad it was you, that day in Red Hollow. I'm glad you were the one who chose me. His face did something complicated, pain and pleasure and regret all mixed together. I'm glad too. He squeezed her hand once more, then climbed back down. Mara sat alone under the stars and tried not to think about the fact that this might be the last peaceful moment any of them ever had. Dawn came gray and cold. They broke camp and rode back toward Frost Ridge, moving carefully, checking for signs of ambush. But the forest was quiet, empty of everything except birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. The cabin stood where they'd left it, looking small and vulnerable in the morning light. They dismounted and went inside, and Silas immediately began checking their defenses. Extra ammunition distributed around the cabin. Water buckets filled in case of fire. Food packed in bags they could grab quickly if they had to run. Whatever happens, Silas said as they worked, we make them pay for every inch. We don't make it easy. Wasn't planning to, Mara replied. Jacob was at the window, keeping watch. "Movement," he said suddenly. "East Trail, multiple riders." They all froze. Silas moved to the window and looked out, his jaw tightening. 20 men, maybe more. Hale's in front. "That was faster than expected," Mara said. "He's done playing." Silas checked his rifle, his movements practiced and calm. "All right, this is it. Positions." They'd rehearsed this. Mara took the front window, Jacob the side, Silas the back. They had overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. It was as ready as they could be. The riders approached slowly, spread out, clearly expecting resistance. They stopped about 100 yards out, just beyond easy rifle range. Victor Hale dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands visible and empty. "Silas Boone," he called out, "I'm here to make you an offer." "We're done negotiating," Silas shouted back. "Hear me out. You fought well, I'll give you that. You've cost me men and money, but this can still end without more bloodshed. Sign over the property deed and I'll let you ride out. You and your wife and that boy. Clean slate, fresh start somewhere else." "The answer is no." "Think about what you're doing. You're outnumbered, outgunned. I'll give you 1 hour to reconsider. After that, we're coming in, and we won't be taking prisoners." Hale turned and walked back to his men. They settled in, clearly preparing for a siege. "He's lying," Mara said. "Even if we signed, he'd kill us the moment we stepped outside." "I know," Silas said, "but he made the offer so there'd be witnesses saying he tried to resolve this peacefully. Now when we're all dead, he can say we forced his hand." "So what do we do?" Silas looked at her and Jacob, and Mara saw acceptance in his eyes. Not defeat, acceptance. "We do what we came here to do. We fight, and we make damn sure the story gets out." The hour passed in tense silence. Mara's hand shook as she checked her rifle for the 10th time. This was different from the chaotic night fight. This was deliberate, calculated. They knew what was coming, and they were choosing it anyway. When the hour ended, Hale stood up. He didn't give a speech or issue a final warning. He just raised his hand and brought it down in a sharp cutting motion. And his men charged. The first wave hit like thunder, 20 men surging forward, using the trees and rocks for cover, firing as they came. Bullets punched through the cabin walls, sending splinters flying. Mara squeezed off her first shot and saw a man stumble. She didn't wait to see if he'd go down. She was already tracking her next target, her training taking over where conscious thought failed. Beside her, Silas fired with mechanical precision. 1 shot, 1 target, reload, repeat. His face was blank, focused entirely on the mathematics of survival. Jacob was cursing steadily under his breath, a stream of profanity that would have been funny under different circumstances. His shots were wilder than Silas's, but he was keeping heads down, and that mattered. The attackers had expected an easy fight. 3 people against 20. It should have been over in minutes. But the cabin's position made frontal assault costly, and Silas had chosen his fields of fire well. Bodies started to pile up in the approach, and the charge faltered. "Fall back!" someone screamed. "Regroup!" Hale's men retreated to cover, dragging their wounded. Mara counted 5 down, maybe 6. That left at least 14 still fighting. Her hand shook as she reloaded, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. "First round to us," Silas said, but there was no triumph in his voice. "They'll be smarter next time." He was right. The second assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, half the men laying down covering fire while the others advanced from the sides. It was coordinated, professional. These weren't just hired thugs anymore. Hale had brought men who knew how to fight. Mara divided her attention between her window and helping cover Jacob's position when the pressure got too heavy. The noise was deafening, gunfire, shouting, the sound of bullets hitting wood and stone. Smoke from spent powder filled the cabin, making her eyes water and her throat burn. A window shattered and a man tried to climb through. Jacob shot him point blank and the body fell backward, but 2 more were right behind. Mara swung her rifle around and fired, worked the lever, fired again. The attackers fell back, but they'd gotten close. Too close. "They're trying to flank," Silas shouted. "Jacob, watch the back door." Jacob sprinted across the cabin just as something heavy slammed against the back door. Once, twice. The bar holding it shut cracked but held. Jacob took position and waited, his rifle aimed at chest height. When the door finally splintered open, he fired 3 times in rapid succession. Screams answered and the door went quiet, but the respite was temporary. Mara could see Hale directing his men from behind cover, pointing, repositioning. He was smart enough to let others take the risks while he orchestrated, and he had numbers on his side. They could lose 10 men and still win. The defenders couldn't afford to lose anyone. "We need to thin their leadership," Silas said, clearly thinking the same thing. "If we can take out Hale, the rest might lose their nerve." "He's too well covered," Mara said. "We need a clear shot, and he's not giving us one." As if hearing her, Hale stepped into view, gesturing to two of his men. It was only for a moment, maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough. Silas lined up the shot, held his breath, squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Hale in the shoulder, spinning him around. He went down hard and didn't get up. His men rushed to drag him to safety, their coordinated assault dissolving into chaos as they focused on their fallen leader. "Did you kill him?" Jacob asked. "Don't think so, but he's out of the fight." Silas was already scanning for new targets. "This is our chance. While they're disorganized, we hit them hard." They poured fire into the confused knot of men trying to help Hale. 2 more went down, then 3. The survivors broke and ran, retreating to the tree line in disorder. For a moment, the yard was empty except for bodies and blood soaking into the snow. Mara's ears were ringing, her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick, and her face felt hot despite the cold. She'd lost count of how many times she'd fired, how many men she'd hit. The cabin reeked of gunpowder and fear sweat, and something else, the copper stink of blood. "Anyone hit?" Silas asked. "I'm fine," Jacob said, though he was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where flying splinters had caught him. "Same," Mara managed. She wasn't fine, none of them were, but she was alive and still capable of fighting, which was as close to fine as anything got right now. Silas moved to the broken window and risked a look outside. "They're regrouping, maybe 10 left who can still fight, but they're talking and they look angry. Hale going down might have scared them off, or it might have pissed them off. Hard to say which." "How much ammunition do we have left?" Mara asked. Silas did a quick count. "Enough for maybe 1 more sustained engagement. After that, we're down to pistols and knives." "So we're dead," Jacob said flatly. "Not yet." But Silas's face said he knew the truth. They'd bloodied Hale's men badly, had fought better than anyone expected, but math was math. They couldn't win this. The standoff stretched into minutes. Outside, Hale's remaining men were having a heated discussion. Some wanted to retreat, Mara could tell by their body language. Others, probably the ones who'd lost friends in the fighting, wanted revenge regardless of cost. Then one of them broke from the group and walked forward, hands raised. He stopped about 50 yards out and called, "We want to talk." "You had your chance to talk," Silas shouted back. "Hale's hurt bad, needs a doctor. We're willing to negotiate a ceasefire. You let us collect our wounded and our dead, we pull back. This ends now, no more killing." Silas looked at Mara and Jacob. "What do you think?" "It's a trap," Jacob said immediately. "Maybe," Mara said, "or maybe they're just tired of dying for Victor Hale's greed. They've lost more than half their number. Even if they win, it'll cost them everything. And if we refuse, they come at us again with nothing to lose," Silas added. "At least if we negotiate, we might buy time to figure out our next move." It was a gamble either way, but they'd been gambling since this started. 1 more roll of the dice couldn't hurt. "All right," Silas called out. "Ceasefire. You collect your people, then we talk terms." Agreed. What followed was surreal. Men who'd been trying to kill each other minutes ago moved around the yard, some retrieving bodies, others helping wounded to safety. Mara watched from the window, her rifle ready in case it was a trick. But the ceasefire held. Nobody shot. Nobody even raised a weapon. When the last body had been carried away, the same man who'd called for the ceasefire approached again. He looked exhausted, his clothes covered in blood that probably wasn't his own. "Name's Carson," he said when he got close enough. "I run supply operations for Hale's company. Never signed on for any of this. Was supposed to be legal work, paperwork, and such. But here we are." "Here we are," Silas agreed. "What do you want?" "I want to go home. And I'm guessing the men with me want the same. We've got 6 dead, another 5 wounded, including Hale. You've made your point. You're not going to be pushed off this land easy, and killing you will cost more than the property's worth." "Hale feel the same way?" Carson's laugh was bitter. "Hale's unconscious, lost a lot of blood. Might not make it to town even if we ride hard. Right now I'm in charge and I'm saying we're done. You keep your mountain, we keep our lives, everyone walks away. Just like that? Mara couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. You expect us to believe you'll just forget about the silver? Carson's eyes widened slightly. So there really is silver. Hale kept saying it, but I wasn't sure. He lies about a lot of things. He rubbed his face. Look, lady, I don't know anything about silver and I don't care. I've got men bleeding, Hale's probably dying, and I just watched good people get shot up over something that never should have come to violence. If there's silver, it's yours. Far as I'm concerned, this whole mess was illegal from the start. Silas studied him, weighing the words. You'd testify to that? To the illegal intimidation? The false claims? If it means I don't end up dead on this mountain? Yeah, I'll testify. I'll sign whatever papers you want. I just want to be done with this. It was the opening they needed. Mara saw Silas recognize it the same moment she did. They had a witness from inside Hale's organization, someone who could corroborate everything. With Carson's testimony added to the others, they'd have an unbeatable case. All right, Silas said. Here's what's going to happen. You take your men and you leave. You get Hale to a doctor if you can. But before you go, you write out everything you know about Hale's operations. The intimidation, the illegal seizures, all of it. You sign it and date it. Then you and your men are free to go. And you won't shoot us when we ride out? No, this ends here. Provided you keep your word. Carson nodded slowly. I can live with that. He paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not all of us wanted this. Some of us just needed the work and didn't ask too many questions. That's on us. Yeah, Silas said quietly. It is. Carson returned to his men and there was more discussion, some of it heated. But eventually they agreed. One of them produced paper and pencil, and Carson wrote out his statement sitting on a rock in the blood-stained yard. When he finished, he brought it to Silas. Everything I know, names, dates, properties seized under false pretenses. There's enough there to bury Hale if he survives. He handed over the papers. I hope it's worth all this death. Silas took the statement without comment. Carson and his men gathered their horses, loaded their wounded, and rode out. They left 6 bodies behind, men Hale had brought to kill for him, who'd never see their homes again. The silence after they left was profound. Mara stood in the yard looking at the cabin with its bullet holes and broken windows, at the patches of red snow that would take days to fully melt. The cost of victory was written in the landscape itself. We did it, Jacob said, his voice wondering. We actually did it. Did we? Mara turned to face him. Look around, Jacob. Look at what we had to do to keep this place. Was it worth it? I don't know, he admitted, but we're alive. That has to count for something. Silas was reading Carson's statement, his face unreadable. When he finished, he folded it carefully and tucked it with the other testimonies. This is enough. More than enough. We can take this to Roland and file formal charges. Hale's done, whether he lives or dies. And the silver? Mara asked. Silas looked at the cabin, at the mountain rising behind it, at the land he'd fought so hard to keep. I don't know anymore. Every time I think about mining it, about bringing people up here, development and noise and all that comes with money, I remember why I came here in the first place, to get away from all of it. You could sell it, Jacob suggested. Sell the property to someone who'd mine it responsibly, take the money and start over somewhere easier. Could, Silas agreed. Or I could just leave it buried. Let the mountain keep its secrets. Mara watched him struggle with it, understanding the weight of the choice. The silver represented security, wealth, everything most people spent their lives chasing. But it also represented everything that had nearly destroyed them. Greed, violence, the corruption that came when people wanted something badly enough. It's your decision, she said finally. But whatever you choose, I'm with you. Silas turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I know you are. That's the problem. Problem? You've stayed through all of this, the fighting, the killing, the constant threat. But you shouldn't have to. You deserve better than a life spent defending a mountain from people who want to tear it apart. He took her hands, his grip gentle despite the calluses and scars. I'm giving you a choice, Mara. The choice I should have given you from the start. We can stay here and spend the rest of our lives waiting for the next Victor Hale to show up. Or we can take that silver, sell this land, and go somewhere you can have a real life. Not just survival, but actual living. Mara stared at him, stunned. You'd leave? After everything? For you? Yeah, I would. His voice was rough with emotion. This place was my refuge after I lost my family. It kept me alive when I didn't want to be. But you reminded me what living is supposed to feel like, and I don't want to waste what time we have hiding on a mountain. Tears pricked Mara's eyes. She thought about the woman she'd been in Red Hollow, desperate and invisible. Thought about the woman she'd become, scarred, dangerous, fully alive in a way she'd never imagined. This mountain had given her that, had given her a place to matter. But Silas was right. They couldn't spend their lives fighting. Eventually they'd lose, or they'd win so many times they'd stop being human and become something harder, colder. She'd seen it in Silas's eyes during the fight, the calculation, the willingness to kill without hesitation. That was what survival demanded. But it wasn't how she wanted to live. What about Jacob? She asked. The young man looked up, surprised to be included. What about me? You helped us fight. You're part of this now. You deserve a say. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. My father gave up and it broke him. I thought the answer was to fight until there was nothing left to fight for. But watching this, seeing what it cost, I don't know. Maybe there's something in between. Maybe you can stand up for yourself without letting it consume you. That's wise, Mara said. For someone so young. I don't feel young anymore. None of them did. The fight had aged them all in ways that had nothing to do with time. 3 days later, they rode into Granite Falls with the testimonies, Carson's statement, and a clear story about what Victor Hale had done. Roland, the attorney Silas had mentioned, was a thin man in his 60s with sharp eyes and sharper questions. He read everything twice, made them explain details, poked holes in their account just to make sure it held up. Finally, he sat back and nodded. This is solid. Better than solid. With Carson's inside testimony and the pattern of behavior documented in the other statements, we can file criminal charges, fraud, intimidation, possibly accessory to murder if we can prove he ordered those attacks. Even if the local officials try to protect him, I can escalate this to the territorial level. Federal marshals will get involved. How long? Silas asked. Weeks, maybe months for the full legal process. But I can get an immediate injunction stopping any further seizures, and I can make sure Hale's assets are frozen pending investigation. Roland looked at them over his spectacles. You three look like you've been through hell. Where will you go while this plays out? Away, Silas said. Far away. They stayed in Granite Falls just long enough to make their statements official, to sign the paperwork that would set the legal machinery in motion. Roland promised to keep them informed, to send word when there was news. Then they rode out, leaving the testimonies and statements behind like anchors they'd finally managed to cut loose. The journey back to Frost Ridge took 4 days. They rode slowly, in no hurry now that the immediate danger had passed. The mountain was beautiful in a way Mara had never really appreciated before. The way light moved through the trees, the sound of water running beneath ice, the absolute silence that came just before snow. When they reached the cabin, Silas dismounted and stood looking at it for a long time. It was damaged but repairable. The bullet holes could be patched, the windows replaced. With work, it could be made whole again. I'm going to miss this place, he said quietly. We don't have to leave right away, Mara said. We could stay through the winter, figure out what comes next. No? Silas shook his head. If we stay, we'll find reasons to never leave. And that's not living, that's just hiding. He turned to face her. I meant what I said. I want a life with you, not just survival. That means leaving this mountain and all its ghosts behind. Jacob had wandered off to give them privacy, examining the shed where he'd hidden during the fight. Mara and Silas stood alone in the yard, the weight of the decision settling over them. Where would we go? Mara asked. South, maybe. California. I hear there's land out there, opportunities for people willing to work. We'd have money from selling the property. We could buy a small ranch, raise horses or cattle, build something new. It sounded impossible and perfect in equal measure, a life where they weren't constantly looking over their shoulders, where they could just be. Two people trying to make something good out of what they'd survived. What about the silver? Mara asked. Won't whoever buys the property want to mine it? Probably. But that's not our problem anymore. Silas pulled her close, and she let herself lean into his warmth. I spent 6 years protecting this place because I thought it was all I had left. But it's not. I have you. That's enough. They spent 2 weeks preparing to leave. The silver was extracted from its hiding place and divided 3 ways. Jacob insisted on taking a share as payment for his help, and neither Silas nor Mara argued. It was enough money for each of them to start over somewhere new, to have the security they'd never known. The cabin was closed up and left to whatever came next. Maybe another trapper would claim it. Maybe it would stand empty for years. Maybe the new owners of the land would tear it down to get at the silver beneath. Silas tried not to think about it too hard. On their last morning, Mara stood on the porch and looked out at Frost Ridge one final time. She'd arrived here broken and desperate, a woman nobody wanted. She was leaving stronger, harder, carrying scars that would never fully fade. This mountain had forged her into someone new, someone who knew her own worth. "Ready?" Silas called from where he was securing the last pack to his horse. "Yeah," Mara said. "I'm ready." They rode out together, 3 people bound by violence and survival, but choosing something better. Jacob planned to head east, back toward settlements where he could reconnect with his father. Maybe they'd rebuild what had been broken between them. Maybe not. But he'd try. Silas and Mara turned south toward California and possibility. The ride would take weeks, maybe months. There would be hardships along the way, challenges they couldn't predict. But they'd face them together, and that made all the difference. 6 months later, word reached them through one of Roland's letters. Victor Hale had survived his injuries, but not his reputation. The investigation had uncovered years of illegal activities, and he'd been arrested on multiple charges. The trial had been brief, too much evidence, too many witnesses willing to testify once they knew they'd be protected. He'd been sentenced to 15 years in a territorial prison, and his company had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate his victims. Red Hollow was quiet now, Roland wrote. The people who'd been driven out were slowly returning, reclaiming what had been taken. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something, more than most people got. Mara read the letter aloud to Silas as they sat on the porch of their new ranch, watching the sun set over California hills that looked nothing like the mountains of Frost Ridge. They'd bought a small property with good water and better soil, had started building a herd of horses that would hopefully sustain them. "We did it," she said, folding the letter carefully. "We actually won." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Did we?" "We're alive and he's in prison, but 6 men died on that mountain. More were wounded. Those bodies don't care about justice." "No," Mara agreed. "They don't. But we didn't start that fight, Silas. Hale did. We just refused to lose it." "Is there a difference?" It was the question that had haunted them both for months. The killing, however justified, had left marks that went deeper than scars. There were nights when Mara woke gasping from dreams of gunfire and blood. Times when Silas stared at nothing, clearly seeing something she couldn't. They'd survived, but survival had costs that couldn't be calculated in dollars or days. "I think so," Mara said finally. "I think there's a difference between fighting to take something and fighting to keep what's yours. It doesn't make the killing easier to live with, but it matters." "Maybe." Silas reached over and took her hand. "I'm glad we left when we did, before we forgot how to be anything except fighters." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Inside, dinner was waiting, simple food but honestly earned. Tomorrow, they'd work on breaking a new horse, mending fence, all the mundane tasks that made up a life. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't the stuff of stories. But it was theirs. Built on their own terms, defended at terrible cost, and finally, carefully, lived in a way that honored both what they'd survived and what they'd lost. A year later, Mara stood in the same spot and watched a wagon approach their property. Her hand instinctively moved to where she kept a pistol tucked in her belt. Some habits were hard to break, but as the wagon drew closer, she recognized the driver. Jacob looked older, more settled. He'd filled out through the shoulders and lost the haunted look that had dogged him for months after the fight. He climbed down from the wagon, grinning. "Thought I'd come to see how you're doing," he said. "Hope that's all right." "More than all right." Mara pulled him into a hug. "You're always welcome here." Silas emerged from the barn, and his face split into a rare, genuine smile. "Look what the wind blew in." They spent the evening catching up. Jacob had reconciled with his father, or started to anyway. It was slow going, rebuilding trust that had been damaged, but they were trying. He'd used his share of the silver to buy a small dry goods store in a town 2 days' ride from Granite Falls. Nothing fancy, but it was his. "What about you?" Jacob asked. "Any regrets about leaving the mountain?" Silas and Mara exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations married people developed. "Some days," Silas admitted. "I wonder what happened to the cabin, whether someone's living there now, if they found all the silver or if some's still buried." "But," Jacob prompted, "but I don't miss the fear. Don't miss checking over my shoulder constantly, wondering when the next threat would come. This is smaller, quieter, but it's ours without conditions." He looked at Mara. "We're building something here that doesn't require blood to maintain it." "That matters," Jacob agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I still have nightmares sometimes. About the fighting, about the men I killed." "So do we," Mara said quietly. "I don't know if that ever stops." "Does it get easier?" "A little. You learn to carry it better, I think. To remember why you did what you did without letting it define everything you are." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We were forced into something terrible, but we got through it without becoming terrible ourselves. That's worth something." They talked late into the night, three people bound by shared trauma, but choosing not to let it be the only thing that defined them. When Jacob left the next morning, he promised to visit again. And he did, becoming a regular presence in their lives. The little brother neither of them had asked for, but both had come to value. 2 years after leaving Frost Ridge, Mara gave birth to a daughter. They named her Clara, after Silas's first daughter. It was his idea, and Mara understood what it meant, that he was finally ready to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. Clara was a loud, opinionated baby who grew into a loud, opinionated child. She looked nothing like Mara or Silas, her features entirely her own. She had no patience for being told what she could or couldn't do because she was a girl, a trait that made Mara laugh, and Silas shake his head in amused resignation. "She gets that from you," he'd say when Clara insisted on learning to break horses alongside the boys they'd hired. "Damn right she does," Mara would reply. The ranch prospered slowly, the way honest work tends to prosper. They never got rich, but they never wanted for necessities. More importantly, they built a life that felt meaningful, raising good horses, helping neighbors when help was needed, teaching Clara that strength came in many forms, and that fighting was always the last resort, never the first. On Clara's 5th birthday, Silas told her a story. Not the whole story. She was too young for the violence, the blood, the weight of what they'd done. But he told her about a mountain far away, about a cabin in the wilderness, and about how sometimes people had to fight not because they wanted to, but because giving up meant losing everything that mattered. "Did you win?" Clara asked, her eyes wide. "We survived," Silas said carefully. "That's a different kind of winning." "I don't understand." "You will someday." Mara watched from the doorway as Silas braided their daughter's hair with gentle hands that had once killed without hesitation. The contradiction didn't escape her, that those same hands could be instruments of both violence and tenderness. But that was the truth of it, wasn't it? People were complicated, capable of terrible things and beautiful things, sometimes in the same breath. She thought about the woman she'd been, standing in Red Hollow, being mocked and dismissed. That woman would have never believed she'd end up here. Married to a man who saw her worth, mother to a fierce little girl, owner of a ranch she'd helped build from nothing. The journey from there to here had been written in blood and fear and desperate choices. But it had also been written in small kindnesses, in Silas choosing her when no one else would, in Jacob's courage, in Carson's decision to walk away from violence when he could have chosen revenge. Years later, when Clara was grown with children of her own, when Mara and Silas were old and weathered by time rather than violence, someone asked Mara if she'd do it all again. "Every bit of it," she said without hesitation. "The fear, the fighting, all of it. Because that's what it took to get here, to become who I am. And I like who I am. Even with the nightmares, the scars, especially with those, they remind me that I fought for my life and won. Not everyone can say that." Silas died first, his heart giving out one spring morning while he was mending fence. He went quickly, without pain, and Mara was grateful for that mercy. She buried him on their land under a tree they'd planted their first year there. Clara stood beside her at the funeral, strong and steady like her mother. "He was a good man," Clara said. "He was," Mara agreed. Not perfect, but good. That's all anyone can really be. Mara lived another 5 years after Silas died. Long enough to see her grandchildren grow into interesting people. Long enough to know the ranch would continue, that the life they'd built wouldn't end with them. On her last day, sitting on the porch in the sun, she thought about Frost Ridge one final time. Wondered if the cabin still stood, if the silver had all been mined out, if anyone remembered the fight that had happened there. Probably not. Most things got forgotten eventually, swallowed by time and distance. But she remembered standing in a frontier town being rejected by everyone until one man looked at her and saw exactly what he needed. Remembered learning to shoot, to fight, to defend what mattered. Remembered the weight of the rifle in her hands, and the moment she'd pulled the trigger, knowing it meant someone's death. She'd carried those memories for decades, had made peace with them as much as anyone could, and in the end, she didn't regret any of it. The violence had been terrible but necessary, the fear overwhelming but survivable, the choice to fight rather than run the defining moment of her life. Mara Quinn Boone died with her granddaughter holding her hand, surrounded by the family she'd helped create. Her last words were quiet, meant for herself more than anyone else. I mattered. I fought, and I mattered. It was true. She had mattered. Not because of the silver or the land or even the fight itself, but because she'd refused to accept the world's judgment that she was too much, too big, too wrong. She'd claimed her own worth with both hands and held on to it through everything that tried to tear it away. That was her legacy. Not just to her family, but to everyone who'd ever been told they didn't fit, didn't belong, weren't good enough. Sometimes you had to fight for your right to exist on your own terms. And sometimes, if you were brave enough and stubborn enough and lucky enough, you won. The ranch continued for another generation before being sold to a family who'd never heard the full story of how it came to be. The new owners found an old rifle in the barn, beautifully maintained but showing signs of heavy use. They hung it over the mantel as decoration, never knowing the weight of history it carried. In Red Hollow, now grown into a proper town with schools and churches and all the trappings of civilization, old-timers still occasionally told stories about the winter Victor Hale tried to seize Frost Ridge. The details got fuzzy over time. Some versions made Silas out to be a giant. Others claimed Mara had fought off 100 men single-handed. The truth, as always, was simpler and more complicated than legend. 3 people had refused to be victims. They'd fought when they had to, killed when necessary, and survived when the odds said they shouldn't. Then they'd had the wisdom to walk away and build something better than survival. That was the real story. Not the violence itself, but what came after. The choice to heal rather than harden, to grow rather than remain trapped by trauma, to believe that they deserved peace and then do the work to achieve it. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not that they'd won a fight, but that they'd refused to let the fight become everything they were. The mountain kept its secrets. The cabin eventually collapsed under the weight of too many winters. The silver was mined out by people who never knew what it had cost to protect it. But the story remained, passed down in fragments and whispers, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage. And that finally was enough.